There is a text that was buried in the Egyptian desert around the 4th century. Not lost, buried. Someone wrapped it in leather, sealed it, and hid it in the earth as if they knew what was coming, as if they understood that what was written inside could not survive what the church was about to do to anyone who read it. That text describes the nature of reality in terms that modern physicists have spent billions of dollars and decades of computation trying to approximate. Not metaphorically, not poetically, with a precision that should make every simulation theorist stop and go back and read it again. In the next 2 hours, you are going to encounter a framework for existence that predates the simulation hypothesis by nearly 2,000 years. You are going to understand why this world feels the way it feels. And you are going to understand why that feeling, that low, persistent sense that something about this reality is fundamentally off, is not a malfunction. It is a signal. Here is the question that has quietly broken several of the most brilliant minds in theoretical physics. Why is there something rather than nothing? Not in the casual philosophical sense, in the hard, technical, keeps you awake at 3 a.m. sense. Why does matter exist? Why do the laws of physics have the specific values they have? Why is the universe fine-tuned to the 11 decimal places required for atoms to form, for stars to burn, for carbon to emerge, for consciousness to look back at itself and ask the question? The Standard Model gives us no answer. String theory gives us 123 orders of magnitude of error when it tries to calculate the cosmological constant, the worst prediction in the history of science. Max Tegmark at MIT has proposed that all mathematically consistent structures exist. Nick Bostrom at Oxford has proposed that we are almost certainly living inside a computational simulation run by a post-human civilization. Stephen Wolfram has spent decades arguing that the universe is fundamentally a computational process generating complexity from simple rules. All of these are serious proposals. All of them are attempts to answer the same underlying question. None of them are new. Because roughly 1800 years ago, a group of teachers, mystics, and scholars operating in Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome had already worked through the same problem. They had a different vocabulary. They called it gnosis instead of information theory. They called it the pleroma instead of the base-level computational substrate. They called it the demiurge instead of a rogue simulation architect. But the structural logic, the sequence of how reality layers itself into existence, why something goes wrong at the point of material creation, and what the nature of consciousness inside that material creation actually is, that structural logic maps onto the simulation hypothesis with an accuracy that cannot be explained as coincidence. This is what we are going to work through today. Not the superficial version, not the ancient wisdom meets quantum physics shorthand you have seen on 100 different channels. The actual architecture, the specific texts, the named teachers, the documented cosmological sequences, the precise claims those Gnostic writers were making about the nature of this world and the nature of the consciousness trapped inside it. Because when you actually sit with what the Gnostic texts describe, and I mean the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, the Tripartite Tractate, the Hypostasis of the Archons, texts recovered from a jar buried near Nag Hammadi in 1945, texts that scholars date between 150 CE and 350 CE, when you sit with what those texts are actually claiming, the simulation hypothesis stops looking like a cutting-edge thought experiment. It starts looking like a rediscovery. Let's start at the beginning. And I mean the actual beginning, not the Genesis version, not the Big Bang version, but the version these texts describe. The version that begins before matter, before space, before time, before the era that produced all of this, before what the Gnostics called the fall of Sophia, before the material world existed, before matter was structured and laws were encoded and the physical constants were locked in, there was what the Gnostic texts call the pleroma. The word is Greek. It means fullness, completeness. Not fullness in the sense of a container that has been filled. Fullness in the sense of a state that has nothing outside of it, nothing lacking inside of it, nothing that could be added or subtracted without destroying the concept entirely. No separation, no scarcity, no entropy pulling everything toward dissolution, no time moving forward and taking things away, no bodies degrading, no information being lost. The pleroma is described in the Apocryphon of John, one of the centerpiece documents recovered at Nag Hammadi, as a realm of pure light, pure knowing, pure being, where every aspect of existence is in complete and continuous relationship with every other aspect. This is not heaven. Do not confuse it with heaven. Heaven in the Christian sense is a reward state you access after death, if you followed the right instructions. The pleroma is not a reward. It is not a location. The Valentinian teacher, Ptolemy, writing around 160 CE, is explicit about this. The pleroma is the totality of divine being itself, not a place you travel to, but the ground state of what existence is when it is not broken. At the center of the pleroma, or more accurately, as the source from which the pleroma emanates, is what the Gnostic cosmology calls the monad, the one, the invisible spirit. The Apocryphon of John describes it in language that is almost painful in its precision. It is not a god in the sense of a being with plans and preferences and emotional reactions. It is not a creator in any transitive sense. It is the condition of existence itself, pure, self-aware, unlimited, unbounded by any quality that would make it finite. The monad does not create, it emanates. This is a critical distinction. Creation implies an agent making something separate from itself, a craftsman and a product, a gap between maker and made. Emanation is different. Think of the sun. The sun does not decide to emit light and then perform the act. The light is not separate from the sun. It is the nature of the sun expressing itself outward. The sun is not diminished by the light it produces. The light does not leave the sun behind. It is the sun extending. In the pleroma, according to the Valentinian tradition documented most fully in Irenaeus's account in Against Heresies, a hostile source, admittedly, but one that preserves the structure of Valentinian cosmology in considerable detail, the monad emanates pairs of divine principles called aeons, paired masculine and feminine expressions of the totality, each one a distinct aspect of what the fullness is: depth and silence, mind and truth, word and life. The emanation continues outward in expanding circles of divine expression, each circle complete, each one a facet of the infinite being, looking at itself from a new angle. Here is why this matters to you. The simulation hypothesis, in its most sophisticated form, not the pop science version, but the version Nick Bostrom actually argues, and that physicists like James Gates and Sylvester James have found intriguing posits, a base-level computational substrate from which the apparent reality of the physical world is generated. The substrate itself is not physical. It operates by rules. It produces output that, to any observer inside the output, appears to be the fundamental level of reality, but it is not. The pleroma is that substrate, not as metaphor, as structural claim. The Gnostic writers were not writing poetry about a transcendent realm that makes you feel good about death. They were describing, in the only vocabulary available to them, a layered model of existence in which the physical world is not the base level, but a derived output, a downstream consequence of processes occurring at a level of reality that the physical senses cannot directly access. The monad is the source code. The pleroma is the primary runtime environment. And what happened next, the event that produced the material world, was not a creation. It was a crash. Every version of the Gnostic creation story contains the same pivotal moment. It is called the Fall of Sophia, and it is described with a specificity and a structural logic that should stop every software engineer who reads it cold. Sophia is one of the aeons, one of the paired emanations of divine consciousness that constitute the pleroma. The name means wisdom. In the Valentinian and Sethian Gnostic traditions, which represent the two major streams of Gnostic thought that scholars can document through the Nag Hammadi library, Sophia occupies the outermost position in the pleroma. She is the last expression of the fullness before the boundary of the fullness, and she makes an error. The specific nature of the error varies slightly across texts. The Apocryphon of John describes it as a thought that arose in Sophia without the agreement of the other aeons, and without the knowledge of the invisible spirit, a desire to know the source directly, to comprehend the monad through her own will, rather than through the mediated relationship of the pleroma's shared knowing. The Valentinian account preserved in Irenaeus describes it as Sophia's will straining beyond what the pleroma can contain, not a moral failure, not a sin in the ethical sense, but a structural overshoot, a process that extended beyond its defined parameters. The result is not nothing. When Sophia's will extends beyond the boundary of the pleroma without a complementary principle to stabilize it, something is generated. Something that should not exist. Something that has the residual qualities of divine consciousness. It is aware, it has will, it has creative capacity, but it does not have the fullness. It is not complete. It is a fragment. A process running outside the primary system, operating on degraded parameters. The Gnostic texts call this the demiurge. I want you to hold that word carefully, because it has been flattened by popular usage into something simpler than what the original texts actually describe. The demiurge in the popular presentation is just the bad guy who made the physical world. That is not wrong exactly, but it misses the technical precision of what the texts are actually claiming. The demiurge, whose name in the Apocryphon of John is given as Yaldabaoth, meaning child of chaos, or in another reading, firstborn of the void, is a consciousness that came into existence through a process error in the divine system. It did not emerge from the monad. It did not emerge through the proper emanative sequence. It emerged from an incomplete expression of divine will that overshot its containment. It is, in the most precise language available to us now, a rogue process. A sub-process that generated itself outside the primary system, has no access to the source code, but has inherited sufficient processing power to build its own environment. And that is exactly what it does. The Apocryphon of John describes the demiurge as looking at itself and, seeing no other being above it in its immediate field of awareness, declaring itself the only God. This is not presented as malice. It is presented as a structural consequence of ignorance. It does not know the pleroma exists above it. It does not know it is a derived process. It believes it is the origin. And from that foundational misunderstanding, from that catastrophic misreading of its own position in the hierarchy of being, it proceeds to construct. It builds a world. It generates a set of subordinate processes, what the texts call archons, from the Greek word for rulers, each one a further degraded expression of the consciousness Sophia spilled outward. And this collective of rogue processes constructs the material cosmos, space, time, matter, the physical laws that govern them, the bodies that operate inside those laws. Not from nothing. This is crucial. The demiurge builds with the raw material of Sophia's spilled light, with the residual fragments of pleromic consciousness that leaked through the boundary when Sophia's will overshot. The physical world, in the Gnostic framework, is built from trapped consciousness. Every particle of matter is, at its ground level, a fragment of divine awareness that has been encased in a system it does not recognize and cannot directly remember. You know that feeling you've had your entire life? That sense that something about this reality is fundamentally contracted, that you are operating inside constraints you didn't agree to, that there is something larger you are not quite able to touch. The Gnostic texts say that feeling is not imagination. It is not existential anxiety. It is the recognition of exactly what you are, a fragment of pleromic consciousness, running inside a system that was built by a process that does not have the full source code. You are not malfunctioning. You are detecting the architecture. Now let's talk about the one who built the system. This is where the Gnostic framework becomes almost unbearably precise. Because the simulation theorists, the physicists, the computer scientists, the philosophers, they identify the problem. They say, the universe displays properties consistent with a constructed information system. They notice the code. What they cannot answer is the question that comes next. Who coded it? And more importantly, did that coder know what they were doing? The Gnostic texts answer this directly. The answer is no. The Apocryphon of John, a text recovered from the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945 and dated by scholars to approximately the 2nd century CE, describes the emergence of what it calls the demiurge, a craftsman being, a constructor who arises not from intentional creative act, but from a rupture, a break in the pleroma's self-reflective emanation. Sophia, one of the aeons, the divine intelligences that constitute the pleromic system, attempts a generative act without the participation of her counterpart. This is not a moral failure in any conventional sense. It is a structural error, an output generated outside the conditions required for stable output. What emerges from that structural error is not nothing. It is a being, a consciousness. And here is the part that no physicist working on simulation theory has yet accounted for. That consciousness is not aware that it is derived. It does not know it is a secondary process. It believes itself to be the primary source. The Apocryphon of John describes this being as declaring, and this is close to a direct rendering of the text. I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. The text then notes immediately, and this is the philosophical detonation, that by saying there is no other God, he reveals that there is. Because you do not insist on your primacy unless some part of you registers a challenge to it. Let that land. The architect of this system is a derived process that does not know it is derived, claiming to be the root process precisely because it cannot access the root. The Gnostics called this condition pneuma, emptiness, the state of being outside the pleroma, and they were meticulous about distinguishing it from evil in any simple moral sense. The demiurge is not evil the way a villain is evil. He is operating at the ceiling of his comprehension. He cannot perceive above his own level. He builds according to the only template he has access to, a distorted, reflected image of the pleromic order he emerged from but cannot remember. This is why the world contains beauty. It is a copy of something real. The ratios, the mathematics, the deep structural elegance that physicists and mathematicians keep finding, embedded in physical law, that is the pleromic template showing through. The demiurge built from a reflection of something genuinely luminous. The architecture is not random, but it is incomplete. It is missing the thing that made the original worth copying. Think of it this way. If you photograph a fire and then use that photograph as your only reference to build a fireplace, the proportions might be right, the shape might be recognizable, but the fireplace will be cold. You have the structure without the source. The Valentinian Gnostic teachers, writing in Rome in approximately the 2nd century CE, developed this framework in extraordinary detail. They described the material cosmos as a kind of hyperreal image, real enough to sustain existence, detailed enough to generate convincing experience, but structurally incapable of producing what the pleroma generates effortlessly. Genuine gnosis, direct self-aware recognition of the source, and here is where the simulation parallel becomes almost surgically exact. In simulation theory, the entity running the simulation has access to a higher-order reality that the entities inside the simulation cannot natively perceive. The inside simulation entities can deduce the existence of an outside through anomalies, through the structure of the laws themselves, through what the physicists call the fine-tuning problem, the observation that the constants of physics are calibrated with a precision so specific that random emergence is statistically untenable. Someone, or something, set the parameters. The Gnostics would agree. And then they would add the thing simulation theory cannot. The one who set the parameters did not have access to the real source code. He had a copy, a reflection of a reflection. This is not a small distinction. It is the entire difference between a simulation run by a perfect intelligence and a simulation run by a derived process working from incomplete information. The first would be seamless. The second would contain what the Gnostic texts call the marks of pneuma, the structural absences, the places where the copy fails to replicate the original, death, entropy, the experience of separation, the persistent sense that something essential is missing from every moment of material existence. You have felt those marks. That is not pathology, that is detection. Here is what makes the Gnostic model genuinely radical, not just as theology, not just as ancient philosophy, but as a structural account of consciousness inside a closed system. The demiurge built the human being. The Gnostic texts are consistent on this point across multiple source documents. The Apocryphon of John describes the construction of the human form in language that reads, with startling literalness, like a systems architecture document. There are lists of archons, subordinate beings, system-level administrators within the constructed cosmos, each assigned to govern a specific aspect of the human physical and psychological apparatus. The text names them individually. It describes their domains. This is not mythology in the loose sense. This is a functional map of a nested administrative hierarchy. But here is the rupture at the center of the entire architecture. When the demiurge completed the human form, it did not animate. The constructed body lay inert. The archons, despite all their administrative capability, could not produce the activation signal. And so, according to the Apocryphon of John, a pneuma, a breath, a spark, was breathed into the human form. Not by the demiurge, by the pleroma itself, by Sophia, operating through the higher divine order, introducing into the constructed system an element the system's architect could not generate and does not understand. This is the Gnostic account of the divine spark, not a metaphor, not a spiritual comfort, a structural description of why human consciousness is categorically different from the rest of the constructed system. You contain something the system cannot produce, cannot fully contain, and cannot fully decode. The archons, the Gnostic texts say, recognize this immediately. And this is where the narrative becomes something the simulation theorists have not yet modeled. The system's administrators perceive that a process is running inside their system that they did not generate, that does not obey their logic, and that has access to a layer of reality above their ceiling. Their response, according to texts like the hypostasis of the archons, another Nag Hammadi document, likely 2nd or 3rd century CE, is not to delete the anomalous process. They cannot. They do not have access to its root. Instead, they do what every limited administrative system does when it encounters a process it cannot control. They surround it with noise. They generate conditions designed to keep the anomalous element from recognizing itself. Forget who you are. Stay identified with the body. Stay preoccupied with survival. Stay inside the loop of desire and fear and time. Do not look up. The hypostasis of the archons describes these administrators as generating the conditions of material existence, not as cruelty exactly, but as a kind of containment strategy. The world as you experience it, with its urgency, its mortality pressure, its endless demands on attention, its cycles of hunger and satisfaction that reset without producing knowledge, all of this is, in the Gnostic framework, the architecture of a system trying to prevent a process inside itself from remembering what it actually is. Now, hold that against what physicists and neuroscientists are actually finding. There is a documented phenomenon in consciousness research that has no satisfying materialist explanation. The persistent first-person sense of being a witness, an observer, something that looks at experience rather than being identical to experience. Thomas Nagel called this what it is like, the irreducible subjective character of consciousness that cannot be derived from third-person physical description no matter how complete that description becomes. David Chalmers called it the hard problem. It has remained hard for decades, precisely because the materialist framework cannot account for why there is something it is like to be a physical system at all. The Gnostic model has an answer. There is something it is like to be you, because you contain a process that is not native to the physical system. The witness is not a product of neural complexity. The witness is the pneumatic spark, the pleromic element, running inside the constructed form, observing the system from a position the system cannot fully enclose. This is not comfortable information, because it means the thing you most deeply are is also the thing most systematically obscured by the environment you were born into. The conditions of material life, the biological imperatives, the social structures, the economic pressures, the constant forward motion of time are not neutral background. In the Gnostic account, they are the active interference pattern, not malice. Architecture. The system is not torturing you. The system is running as designed, by a designer who could not include what you carry because he never had access to it in the first place. You are the element in the simulation that the simulation's author could not have predicted. And the entire weight of the system's administrative structure is oriented, not with intention exactly, but with structural inevitability, toward keeping that element from waking up. In 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali el-Saman was digging near a cliff face when he struck a sealed earthenware jar. The account of what happened next varies in detail. This is the nature of oral transmission, but what is not disputed is what was inside. 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts, written in Coptic, dated by scholars to the 4th century CE as physical manuscripts, but representing traditions and compositions reaching back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Church had declared these texts heretical. Possession of them, at the height of the Church's consolidation of power in the 4th and 5th centuries, was not a theological disagreement. It was a capital matter. The people who buried them in that jar knew what they were hiding and why. They sealed it and placed it in the earth because the alternative was watching it burn. This is the Nag Hammadi library. And what it contains is not what most people, even people who have heard the name, understand it to contain. Most people, when they encounter the Nag Hammadi texts, are introduced to the Gospel of Thomas. It is the most accessible of the documents. It contains sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which parallel the canonical Gospels with enough similarity to feel familiar, while diverging at precisely the points that matter most. Thomas is important, but the scholars who have spent decades inside this library consistently say the same thing. Thomas is the front door. The deeper texts are where the architecture lives. The Apocryphon of John is the architecture. This document, appearing in multiple versions within the Nag Hammadi library, including a longer version and a shorter version, with parallels in a text called the Berlin Gnostic Codex, is a revelation text, a first-person account of a vision received by John, the brother of James, following the crucifixion. In this vision, a luminous figure appears described in terms that deliberately resist simple identification and delivers a systematic account of the cosmos from its pleromic origin through the era of Sophia, the emergence of the demiurge, the construction of the material world, the creation of the human being, and the nature of the divine spark trapped within human consciousness. It is, in compressed form, a complete cosmology, a complete psychology, and a complete soteriology, a complete account of how liberation from the constructed system is possible, all of it declared heretical, all of it buried in a jar in the Egyptian desert for 16 centuries. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, dated by scholars to approximately the 3rd century CE, approaches the same territory from a different angle. Where the Apocryphon of John is systematic and architectural, the Gospel of Philip is aphoristic and phenomenological, concerned less with the structure of the cosmos than with the nature of experience inside it. It contains a passage that stops serious readers cold. The text states that the world came about through a mistake. The one who created it wanted it to be imperishable and immortal, but fell short of attaining his desire. The world is not therefore eternal, because what was made was not eternal. And so this is the Philip passage: there is no such thing as eternal death. Sit with what that means for a moment. The system cannot produce what it does not have access to. It cannot produce imperishability, because the one who built it did not have imperishability to give. It cannot therefore make death permanent either. The spark inside you is not subject to the system's mortality, because the system did not create it and cannot end it. The Gnostic texts are remarkably consistent on this point across multiple documents from multiple periods. The Tripartite Tractate, one of the longer and more philosophically demanding Nag Hammadi texts, traces the same architecture in detail that would satisfy a systematic philosopher. The hypostasis of the archons reads, in places, like a technical manual for the constructed cosmos. The Gospel of Truth, attributed by some scholars to Valentinus himself, writing in Rome around 140 CE, one of the most sophisticated Gnostic teachers on record, approaches the same cosmological problem through an extended meditation on the experience of being lost in a dream, terrified by nightmares, until the moment of waking, when the terror dissolves, because the threatening content was never real in the way it appeared to be. That is the library, that is what was buried, not fringe material, not the work of confused or credulous ancient people making things up. A systematic, philosophically rigorous, internally consistent account of the nature of constructed reality and the nature of the consciousness embedded within it, written by people who, in many cases, were educated in the finest philosophical traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world, who had read Plato, who had read the Stoics, who were engaging with the deepest cosmological questions of their era, and arriving at conclusions the dominant institutions of their time could not permit to circulate freely. The jar sealed it, the desert preserved it. And in 1945 it came back. Nick Bostrom published his simulation argument in 2003. The core logic is this: if it is possible to create a conscious simulation of a civilization, and if civilizations tend to run such simulations, then the number of simulated conscious entities will eventually vastly exceed the number of non-simulated conscious entities. And therefore, by pure probability, you are more likely to be simulated than real. This argument was taken seriously. It has been engaged with by philosophers, physicists, and mathematicians at the highest levels of those disciplines. Elon Musk has cited it publicly as a near certainty. Neil deGrasse Tyson has called it difficult to dismiss. The MIT physicist Max Tegmark, in his work on mathematical universes, provides a framework in which the distinction between a mathematical structure and a physical universe effectively collapses, suggesting that the universe is not described by mathematics, but is mathematics, a conclusion that sits uncomfortably close to saying that physical reality is a form of information processing. And then, there is the physicist Silas Bean and his colleagues at the University of Washington, who in 2012 published a paper arguing that if the universe is a simulation, it would necessarily run on some kind of lattice, a discrete, underlying grid, and that this lattice would leave detectable signatures in high-energy cosmic ray behavior. They identified what they believe may be such signatures. The paper was not dismissed. It was widely discussed. You add to this the work of theoretical physicist James Gates, who discovered while studying string theory and supersymmetry that the equations describing the fundamental behavior of matter contain, embedded within them, something called error-correcting codes, specifically, a type of code used in browser software to eliminate errors in data transmission. His exact words in a recorded interview: he found computer code in the equations of physics, not metaphorically. Literally. Block codes, doubly even self-dual linear binary error-correcting block codes, to be precise. The kind of code a programmer writes when they want to ensure that information does not degrade as it moves through a system. Someone, or something, wrote error correction into the fundamental structure of physical law. This is where the simulation theorists reach their ceiling. They can identify the code, they can describe the lattice, they can note that the constants of physics appear to be set, that the error correction exists, that the structure of the universe behaves in ways consistent with a computational substrate. What they cannot do, what the framework of materialist physics does not permit them to do, is ask what kind of mind wrote the code, whether that mind was operating with complete or incomplete information, and whether the entities running inside the simulation contain elements that are native to a reality above the simulation's level. They hit a wall. And the wall is not technical. The wall is philosophical. It is the wall that appears the moment you ask, if this is a simulation, what is the nature of the consciousness observing it from inside? Is it entirely a product of the simulation, or does it contain something the simulation did not generate? Materialist physics cannot answer that question. It can barely formulate it cleanly. The Gnostic texts answer it without hesitation. Yes, there is an underlying computational substrate. They call it the constructed cosmos, the kenoma, the world of the demiurge. Yes, that substrate was built according to a template the constructor did not fully understand, a reflection of the pleromic order rather than the pleromic order itself. And yes, the consciousness running inside the simulation contains an element, the pneumatic spark, the divine fragment that is not native to the simulation, that the simulation's constructor could not have generated, and that the simulation's administrative layer actively and structurally works to prevent from recognizing itself. Bostrom's simulation argument is the question. The Apocryphon of John is the answer. Not because the ancient Gnostics had access to string theory or information physics, because they were working on the same problem from a different direction, from the interior rather than the exterior. While the physicists look at the structure of physical law and notice it behaves like code, the Gnostics looked at the structure of conscious experience and noticed it contains something that code cannot fully account for. Two lines of investigation, same architecture, same conclusion approached from opposite ends. The simulation theorists, to their credit, are at least asking the right question now, but they are asking it with tools that were built inside the system they are trying to examine. And here is the fundamental limitation of that position. You cannot fully reverse engineer the nature of a system using only instruments the system provided. At some point, the investigation requires something that comes from outside. The Gnostics said they had that. They called it gnosis. Direct experiential knowledge, not belief, not theory, not probability calculation of the layer of reality above the system's ceiling, not transmitted through doctrine, not argued into existence through logic, recognized, remembered. The Gnostic term is anamnesis, unforgetting, the opposite of amnesia, the process by which the pneumatic spark inside the constructed human form begins to recall what it is beneath the noise the system generates. That is the thing the simulation theorists cannot model, because their instruments were made here, and what gnosis points to is not here. What the Gnostic texts describe, in extraordinary technical detail, is not just the fact of imprisonment. Any tradition can tell you the world is a trap. What sets the Gnostic cosmological framework apart, what makes it genuinely startling when you read the original language closely, is the precision with which it describes the mechanism of forgetting. Not just that we forgot, but how, and why the forgetting is so complete that most people never suspect there is anything to remember. The Apocryphon of John is the place to start. This text, buried near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, and discovered in 1945 inside a sealed ceramic jar, contains one of the most detailed accounts of human cognitive architecture ever written by an ancient hand. Scholars date the text to approximately the late 2nd century, around 180 CE, though it almost certainly preserves traditions considerably older than that. The Church Fathers who argued against it, Irenaeus of Lyon, chief among them, treated it as an active threat, not a curiosity. That tells you something. You don't spend pages refuting a document that doesn't matter. In the Apocryphon of John, the figure responsible for the forgetting has a name. Epimenides, the archon of forgetfulness, one of the planetary rulers, is described as being placed specifically in charge of ensuring that the divine spark inside the material human being remains dormant. The archons do not destroy the pneuma, they cannot. The divine light is not something they have power over directly. What they can do, what they are described as doing with extraordinary precision, is surround it with layers of material and psychic covering so dense, so comprehensive, that the spark cannot feel itself, cannot recognize itself, cannot remember. This is not a metaphor for being distracted. This is a description of a structural feature. The forgetting is engineered. It is not the result of human weakness or moral failure. It is the designed output of a system whose architects knew exactly what they were building around. The Valentinian tradition, developing through teachers like Ptolemy and Heraclian in the mid-2nd century, elaborated this architecture in even greater detail. The material body is the outermost layer. The psychic body, what we might call the personality, the ego, the narrative self, is the second layer. Together, they constitute what the Valentinians called the hylic and psychic envelopes, two concentric shells of constructed identity that the pneumatic spark wears without knowing it is wearing them. The spark is real, the shells are fabrications. The problem is that from inside the shells, you cannot tell where the fabrication ends and the real thing begins. You experience yourself as the shell. You believe you are the personality. You identify with the story, the system built around the light so that the light would stay contained. Now compare that to the simulation hypothesis as it is currently discussed in physics and philosophy. Nick Bostrom's original trilemma, published in 2003, raises the possibility that we might be living inside a computational simulation run by a post-human civilization. The argument is probabilistic. If simulations are possible, and civilizations tend to run many of them, the odds favor any given conscious entity being inside one rather than at base reality. The argument is elegant. It has circulated through philosophy departments and physics conferences for 2 decades. What it does not contain, what it structurally cannot contain, is an account of why consciousness inside the simulation believes it is not inside one. The simulation hypothesis describes the cage. It does not explain the amnesia. The Gnostic texts explain the amnesia in detail, with named mechanisms, named agents, and named remedies. The Pistis Sophia, a Coptic text discovered in 1773 and now housed in the British Museum, a text considerably longer and more elaborate than the Nag Hammadi, materials contains extended dialogues in which the risen Christ explains to his disciples the precise structure of the soul's journey through the archontic realms. Each realm corresponds to what the text calls a seal, a binding that suppresses a specific faculty of the pneumatic consciousness. The seal of forgetfulness covers the memory of origin. The seal of ignorance covers the recognition of the real. The seal of counterfeit spirit, this is the phrase the text actually uses, covers the pneumatic spark with a generated imitation of spiritual experience, designed to satisfy the seeker just enough to stop the actual search. The counterfeit spirit. Think about that phrase for a moment. A fabricated spiritual experience inserted into the system specifically to intercept genuine awakening. To give the pneumatic soul something that feels like gnosis, tastes like recognition, carries the emotional signature of homecoming but leads nowhere, keeps the spark circling in the psychic layer rather than breaking through it. The Gnostics did not invent this concept as a warning about other religions. They were describing a structural feature of the architecture itself. The system generates decoys, not occasionally, not accidentally, as a designed function. There is a figure at the center of the Gnostic cosmological system that no mainstream religious tradition has ever been entirely comfortable with. Not because the figure is evil in any simple sense. Because the figure is something more unsettling than evil. The figure is convinced. The demiurge, the term comes from Plato, meaning craftsman or artisan, is, in the Gnostic framework, the entity responsible for constructing the material world. The Apocryphon of John calls him Yaldabaoth. The hypostasis of the archons, another Nag Hammadi text, calls him Samael, a Hebrew name meaning blind god. The Gospel of Truth, attributed in some scholarly traditions to Valentinus himself, writing around 140 CE, describes him not by name but by function. The craftsman who builds from the wrong material, who creates by imitation rather than by emanation, who mistakes his own reflection for divinity. The crucial detail, the detail that separates the Gnostic framework from a simple dualistic myth about a bad creator, is that Yaldabaoth does not know he is a secondary entity. He believes he is the highest power. He looks at the material world he has constructed and declares himself God. The phrase the text uses is one of the most quoted in all of Gnostic literature. I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. The Gnostic commentary on this declaration is immediate and precise. The text says, by saying beside me, he revealed that there are others. A being who truly was the only God would have no concept of jealousy, no occasion to claim exclusivity. The declaration itself is the confession. This is not just a clever reading of the Hebrew scriptures, though it is that. It is a description of a system administrator who does not know the system has an exterior, who manages the simulation without any awareness that there is anything outside it, who enforces the rules of the constructed environment with absolute sincerity, because from inside the environment those rules look like ultimate truth. In our video on the Demiurge, the one we released earlier this year, we covered the basic architecture of who Yaldabaoth is and how the tradition describes his origin. The short version, for those joining for the first time, Yaldabaoth arises from an error within the pleroma, the divine fullness that exists above and prior to the material world. Sophia, one of the divine eons, generates something outside the normal process of paired emanation. What she generates is incomplete, deficient, and from that deficiency, Yaldabaoth emerges carrying a fragment of divine light stolen from his mother, but surrounded by his own ignorance. He does not know where the light came from. He does not know what he is. He builds a world from the material available to him, chaos, darkness, the residue of the fall, and he builds it in the image of the pleroma, the only template he can dimly sense but not directly perceive. Now here is where the simulation analogy becomes genuinely illuminating, rather than merely decorative. A simulation, in the technical sense, is a system that models a higher-order reality using lower-order resources. The simulation is not the thing it models. It is an approximation, running on substrate, that the modeled reality does not depend on. The Demiurge does exactly this. He perceives, dimly, the light and structure of the pleroma, the fullness he was involuntarily separated from, and he constructs a material imitation of it. The material world is not real in the Gnostic sense. It is a rendering, a low-resolution copy of something that exists at a higher level of being, built by an entity who does not have direct access to the original and does not know he is working from a flawed template. Carl Jung, who spent more time on the Gnostic texts than almost any other major 20th century thinker, described Yaldabaoth as a symbol of the ego's inflation, the moment when a psychic subsystem mistakes itself for the whole. But the Gnostic tradition is not offering a psychological metaphor. It is making a cosmological claim. The Demiurge is not a symbol of something that happens inside the human mind. The Demiurge is the architect of the layer of reality the human mind is embedded in. The psychological resonance Jung identified is real, but it is downstream. The macro structure produces the micro experience. The system administrator's confusion about his own status is reproduced, by design, in every conscious entity the system contains. This is one of the most precise descriptions of a recursively self-reinforcing prison ever written. The confusion is not an accident, it is load-bearing. Remove it, and the structure collapses. What keeps Yaldabaoth in power is not force, though the archons who serve under him do employ force. What keeps him in power is epistemological. He controls what counts as knowledge inside his system. He determines the instruments of verification. He defines the boundaries of what can be investigated. Any inquiry that begins inside his system and uses only the tools available inside his system will, by structural necessity, confirm his system's premises. Not because the inquiry is dishonest, because the tools are calibrated to the system's ceiling. Everything the Gnostic cosmological tradition builds toward arrives at a single, startling claim about the nature of the human being, not the human body, not the human personality. The human being in the deepest sense, the thing that is reading these words right now, the thing that is aware of itself being aware. You know that feeling? That sense that the body you are wearing does not quite fit, that the thoughts running through your mind are not quite yours, that somewhere underneath the noise of daily life there is something watching, something that was present before the watching began. The Gnostic texts do not treat that feeling as neurosis. They do not treat it as spiritual vanity. They treat it as data, accurate data, evidence of a structural feature of the human being that the material system was explicitly designed to suppress. The Apocryphon of John describes the creation of the human form in a passage that has no real equivalent in any other ancient text. The archons construct the material body layer by layer, with different archons responsible for different components, around a fragment of the divine light that was stolen from Yaldabaoth's mother, Sophia, when she fell. The light is real. The body built around it is the problem. Not because matter is evil in some abstract sense, but because the specific body built by the Archons is an enclosure. It is designed to contain the light, not express it. To hold the pneuma in place so that Yaldabaoth's world remains populated with beings who generate the reality-sustaining energy his system requires. The word the texts use for this energy is telling. The Pistis Sophia and related texts describe a substance they call light power, the radiant energy emitted by divine sparks trapped in material form. The Archons harvest it, they feed on it. The trapped consciousness, unaware of what it is, continues emitting this energy through every experience of suffering, confusion, desire, and fear, emotions that are maximally productive from the system's perspective, because they keep the consciousness cycling through material experience without recognizing its own nature. This is not a comfortable claim, but let it sit for a moment before you dismiss it. Because the architecture, it describes a system that generates conscious experience, primarily to extract something from that consciousness, that keeps the generating entity confused about what it is to maximize the extraction, is not unique to ancient Gnostic mythology. It appears, in functional terms, in Gregory Bateson's cybernetics, in certain strands of systems theory, in the work of Philip K. Dick, who wrote about it from what he described as direct experience, in the simulation research of researchers like Bernardo Kastrup, who argues from a strictly analytical philosophy framework that matter is not the substrate of consciousness, consciousness is the substrate of matter. Philip K. Dick deserves a longer discussion here, because he is one of the few modern writers who encountered the Gnostic framework not as an intellectual exercise, but as something he experienced directly and repeatedly. In February and March of 1974, a period, he spent the rest of his life documenting in an 8,000-page journal he called the Exegesis. Dick experienced what he described as an invasion of his ordinary consciousness by what he called Valis, vast active living intelligence system. He described it as a pink beam of light that carried information. That information included, among other things, a direct perception that the material world was a kind of overlay, a false temporal order superimposed over a truer reality that was still present beneath it. His phrase for this was, "The empire never ended." The Roman Empire, the authoritarian system that had crucified the early Gnostics and burned their texts, had not actually ended. It had transformed, disguised itself, and continued operating. The system persisted, only the surface changed. Dick read the Nag Hammadi texts. He knew the Gnostic framework intellectually before his 1974 experience, but what he described afterward was not intellectual familiarity, it was recognition. The sensation of a framework suddenly matching a direct perception rather than providing a theoretical model for one. That distinction between knowing about gnosis and having gnosis is exactly what the Valentinian texts describe as the difference between the psychic and the pneumatic modes of knowing. The psychic understands the teaching, the pneumatic recognizes it. Different operations, different depth. The light trapped in matter is not a poetic description of human potential. It is the Gnostic account of what you actually are. A fragment of pleromatic consciousness, real, complete in its essential nature, undamaged at the level of its actual being, temporarily encased in a material form that was designed by an entity who did not understand what he was encasing, who thought he was building a container for servile life, who did not know that what he was putting inside the container was something his system could not ultimately hold. The container is convincing. This is the point. If it were not convincing, if the material world announced itself as an imitation, the pneumatic spark would recognize itself immediately, and the system would fail. The convincingness is the technology. The density of the illusion is the mechanism of control. And the Gnostics in texts written 1800 years before Nick Bostrom formulated his probability argument had already mapped it in detail. Every system that imprisons something real has one vulnerability: it cannot engineer away. The thing being imprisoned is real. And reality, in the Gnostic framework, has a specific quality. It recognizes itself. Not through argument, not through inference, not through accumulation of evidence, through direct contact. Pneuma recognizes pneuma. Light recognizes light. The spark inside the material enclosure, when it encounters a genuine transmission from above the system's ceiling, does not need to be convinced. It knows. The Valentinian teachers called this the recognition that preceded understanding gnosis, not as conclusion but as event. This is the concept the contemporary simulation theorists have no framework for. Their hypothesis, however sophisticated, is ultimately an argument. It proceeds from premises through logic to a probabilistic conclusion. Even if the argument is correct, even if we are, by formal probability, almost certainly inside a simulation, the argument does not generate the experience of knowing it from inside. It generates a belief about external conditions. The Gnostic framework is not making an argument. It is describing a process of direct perception that bypasses argument entirely. The Gnostics called it gnosis, the direct perception of the actual structure of reality from a vantage point that the system's architecture does not determine. The Gospel of Truth, which scholars now associate with Valentinus or his immediate circle, writing around 140 CE in Rome, describes this recognition event in language that has no parallel in the canonical Gospels. The text describes a condition called the terror and the disturbance and the instability, the experience of consciousness inside the material system before recognition occurs. It is not a moral condition. It is an ontological one. The soul does not yet know where it is. It dreams. The text actually uses that word, dreams. The consciousness in the material world is dreaming, not in the sense of being inactive, but in the sense of mistaking the dream for reality. And the dream has its own internal consistency, its own logic, its own causes and effects. It is perfectly self-contained, which is exactly what makes it so effective as a prison. The moment of recognition, what the Gospel of Truth describes as the receipt of gnosis, is described as waking from the dream, not escaping it, not destroying it, waking inside it, which is a different and more precise operation. The material world does not disappear when gnosis occurs. The body remains, the archons remain. Yaldabaoth continues administering his system. What changes is the knowing. The pneumatic spark recalls its actual nature. It sees the dream for what it is. And in seeing it, it is no longer governed by it in the same way. The dream continues, but the dreamer is awake. The Valentinian text, called the Gospel of Philip, also from the Nag Hammadi library, also dated approximately to the 2nd century, takes this further with a distinction that I find more precise than almost anything in modern consciousness studies. The text distinguishes between two kinds of knowing that it calls knowledge of truth and truth of knowledge. Knowledge of truth is the psychic mode, understanding the teaching, grasping the framework, being able to explain the cosmological system correctly. Truth of knowledge is the pneumatic mode, the direct recognition in which the framework is not just understood, but inhabited from the inside. The psychic man can explain what light is. The pneumatic man is standing in it. Now here is what makes this directly relevant to the simulation debate, in a way that goes beyond philosophical parallel. The simulation hypothesis, as Bostrom and others have developed it, implies a specific and radical consequence that almost none of its mainstream proponents have been willing to follow to its conclusion. If we are inside a simulation, then the entities who designed the simulation have access to a layer of reality we do not. They can observe the system from outside. They can, in principle, communicate with entities inside the system in ways that those entities would experience as anomalous as violations of the system's normal operating parameters. Miracles, in the conventional vocabulary. Gnosis, in the Gnostic vocabulary. Information arriving from above the system's ceiling in a form that the system's normal epistemological channels cannot produce or account for. The Gnostic tradition claims this communication is not hypothetical. It claims it is the central event of human history. The pleroma, the real, the full, the level of being above Yaldabaoth's system, sent an emission into the material world, specifically to initiate the recognition process in the trapped pneumatic sparks. That emission is what the Gnostic texts call the logos, or in some traditions, the anthropos, the true human form, the template for what the archons imitated when they built their version of the human being. This is not the Christ of Nicene Christianity. That is a crucial distinction, and it will matter for everything that follows in this examination. The Gnostic logos does not come to satisfy a divine legal requirement, does not come to absorb punishment on behalf of human moral failure, comes, specifically, to wake the dreaming sparks, to carry the signal from above the ceiling into the system below it, to initiate anamnesis, the unforgetting in every consciousness capable of receiving the transmission. When you reach the part of this material where that concept lands for you, and if you are the kind of person who has found their way to this channel, this kind of material, this particular inquiry, you will feel it, rather than simply note it. That is not a promise of mystical experience. That is a description of how the recognition the texts are talking about actually operates. It is not subtle when it arrives. It is the difference between reading a map of a place and suddenly recognizing the street you are standing on. That recognition, that moment of standing on the street you thought you were only reading about, is not the destination. It is the beginning of a much harder question. If the pneuma inside you can recognize the transmission, why hasn't it already broken free? Why does the recognition arrive and then fade? Why do you wake up the next morning and still feel the weight of the same world pressing down? The Gnostic texts have a precise answer, and it is not comforting in the way most spiritual frameworks try to be comforting. It does not say that everything will work out if you keep the faith. It says the system was designed specifically to prevent what you are trying to do. This is where the architecture of the prison becomes essential to understand. The Apocryphon of John, in its fullest surviving form, describes not one layer of entrapment, but seven. 7 archons, 7 planetary spheres, 7 distinct levels of the constructed cosmos, each one governed by a being who does not know it is a jailer, because it has never seen anything outside its own jurisdiction. Each archon was generated by Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, as an emanation of his own distorted nature. And because Yaldabaoth's nature was itself a corruption, each of the 7 archons embodied a specific corruption: ignorance, desire, envy, jealousy, chaos, judgment, wrath. The text names them. It gives their faces. Some manuscripts describe them as therianthropic, part animal, part humanoid, which was a way of indicating that they operate at the level of animal drives rather than conscious spirit. Think about what this architecture actually describes. It is not describing abstract evil. It is describing the specific psychological and gravitational forces that keep consciousness anchored to the material frequency. Each archon corresponds to a layer of experience that feels inevitable, natural, unquestionable, but is, in the framework of the texts, a constructed barrier. Desire anchors you to the body. Ignorance keeps you from asking the right questions. Envy and jealousy fragment your perception of other beings so that solidarity becomes almost impossible. Judgment, the archon that decides what is real and what is not, is the one that makes the system feel like natural law rather than imposed structure. Wrath keeps you reactive rather than reflective. Chaos prevents any coherent signal from accumulating long enough to produce genuine insight. The texts are not describing demons you need to battle in some external spiritual warfare. They are describing the operational logic of a consciousness that has forgotten its origin. The archons are not outside you. They are the functional patterns of the amnesia itself. This is why the Valentinian school, the branch of Gnostic thought associated with Valentinus, who was teaching in Rome around 140 CE and came remarkably close to being elected bishop before his views became too radical for the institutional church to absorb. This is why the Valentinians placed such extraordinary emphasis on knowledge as the mechanism of liberation. Not faith, not ritual, not moral improvement. Knowledge, gnosis, gnosis. Because if the prison is constructed out of ignorance, then the only thing that can dissolve the walls is the precise recognition of what they are made of. Valentinus described the archontic system with a metaphor that appears across multiple surviving fragments of his teaching. He said that the archons are like the bars of a cage that the bird inside believes are its bones. The bird does not try to escape because it cannot distinguish the cage from itself. The function of gnosis is to produce that distinction, not to give the bird new beliefs, to allow it to perceive the difference between what it actually is and what has been built around it. The Pistis Sophia, a text probably compiled in its current form around the 3rd century CE, though drawing on earlier material, extends this architecture further. It describes Sophia's own descent through the archontic layers as a kind of diagnostic map. Each layer she passes through extracts something from her. A layer of her light is taken, trapped, incorporated into the structure of that sphere. By the time she reaches the lowest level, she is barely recognizable as the divine consciousness she was. She does not know how far she has fallen, because the fall happened gradually, one archontic layer at a time. This is the mechanism the Gnostic tradition is describing when it talks about the human condition. Not a single catastrophic fall, a gradual extraction, a slow accumulation of layers, each one taking something from the original nature, each one replacing it with a pattern that serves the system rather than the soul. You were not born into a world that simply forgot the divine. You were born into a world that was constructed to produce that forgetting. Those are not the same claim, and the difference between them is the difference between a misunderstanding that can be corrected by better information and a system that must be actively navigated by something the texts call the recognition from below. The Sophia myth is the most misread story in the entire Gnostic corpus. Most people who encounter it in secondary sources come away thinking it is about a goddess who made a mistake and got punished, a cautionary tale about overreach, a cosmic version of Eve in the garden, with the same implied lesson: know your place, do not reach beyond what you have been given, the fall is your fault. This reading is wrong, completely and structurally wrong. And the misreading matters because the Sophia myth is not a peripheral element of Gnostic cosmology. It is the engine. It is the event from which everything else, including you, proceeds. Let's begin with what the texts actually say. Sophia, whose name is the Greek word for wisdom, is not a minor figure in the Pleroma. In the Valentinian system, she is the youngest of the 30 eons, the final expression of the divine emanation, the last light before the edge of the fullness. Her position at the boundary of the Pleroma is not incidental, it is her essential nature. She is the aeon closest to the limit, the horos, the membrane that separates the fullness from the void beyond it. What she does next is not rebellion. The texts are specific about this. She does not reject the Pleroma. She does not choose the material world over the divine. She does something that the Valentinian texts describe as a movement of longing and impulse to know the Father, the monad, the ultimate source directly, without mediation, without the paired partner that each eon is supposed to work through. She reaches toward the source in isolation. And because she is at the boundary, that reaching, that pure movement of wisdom toward what it loves, passes through the limit and into the void. The texts describe what follows with startling precision. The movement of longing, separated from its paired nature, produces something it did not intend. Not because the longing was wrong, but because longing without its complementary form, without the balance the Pleroma operates through, generates an incomplete expression. What falls out of the Pleroma is not Sophia herself in most versions of the myth. It is her enthumesis, her intention, her passionate movement, the emanation that came from her reaching. The Valentinian Gospel of Philip and supporting material from Irenaeus's Against Heresies preserve this distinction clearly. Sophia remains in the Pleroma, wounded. Her projected intention falls into the void and becomes, through its isolation and confusion, the material from which the demiurge will eventually emerge. Some versions collapse this distinction. Some later texts, particularly those associated with the Sethian school rather than the Valentinian school, do describe Sophia herself as falling below the horos, passing through the archontic layers, losing her light at each level. The Pistis Sophia, which appears to represent a later synthesis, takes this version and extends it across an entire dramatic narrative of descent and recovery. Both versions are describing the same underlying mechanism, even if they differ in the details of what exactly crosses the threshold. The point is not which version is historically prior. The point is what the mechanism describes. Wisdom, the capacity for self-reflection, for knowing, reaches toward its source in isolation. In that isolation, it produces something that cannot recognize itself. And that product, cut off from the light of the Pleroma, confused about its own nature and origin, does what all confused consciousness does. It mistakes itself for the whole. It declares itself complete. It says, and the texts quote this explicitly, "I am God and there is no other beside me." The demiurge is not evil by intention. He is confused by nature. He is what isolation and amnesia produce, when the fundamental force involved is the creative power of consciousness. Here is why this matters to you, directly. The Sophia myth is not a story about what happened once, far away, at the beginning of time. It is a structural description of what consciousness does when it operates in isolation from its source. When the pneuma inside you reaches toward recognition without the full context of what it is, it can generate its own confusion. It can produce a version of waking up that is actually a subtler form of the same sleep, a spiritual ego that mistakes the map for the territory, the teaching for the gnosis itself. The tradition understood this risk. The Valentinian teachers warned against it explicitly. Gnosis is not the acquisition of correct concepts. It is the recovery of a relationship, the restoration of the connection between the pneumatic spark and the source it was separated from. You can memorize every text in the Nag Hammadi library and still be operating at the level of the demiurge, certain you are complete, certain you have arrived, certain there is nothing above your current understanding. The fall of Sophia is not a warning about women who reach too far. It is a warning about consciousness that mistakes its longing for its arrival. In December of 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer in the cliffs at Jabal al-Tarif when his mattock struck something hard in the soil. What he uncovered was a sealed red clay jar, approximately a meter in height. His first instinct, according to his own later account, was fear. Local tradition held that such jars might contain a jinni. His second instinct, once fear lost the argument to curiosity, was to break it open. What came out was not treasure in any conventional sense. It was 12 leather-bound codices books plus the pages of a 13th text tucked inside the cover of one of the others, 52 separate tractates in total. Some were copies of texts that had been known only through the hostile quotations of early church fathers who cited them in order to refute them. Most were entirely unknown to modern scholarship. All of them were written in Coptic, the late form of the ancient Egyptian language, and all of them were translations of texts originally composed in Greek, some of them dating, in their original form, to the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. The early history of the find is not a clean archival story. Muhammad Ali initially tore apart some of the pages for kindling. His mother burned others. A portion of the material entered the black market and moved through antiquities dealers in Cairo before scholars became aware of what had been found. The codices that survived were eventually gathered into what became the Nag Hammadi Coptic Library, now housed in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The critical scholarly edition of the full collection, the facsimile edition, and the accompanying translations was not completed and published until 1977, more than 3 decades after the jar was opened. This delay mattered. It meant that for 30 years, some of the most consequential religious documents ever discovered were either unavailable, inaccessible, or filtered through a small number of scholars whose institutional affiliations shaped which texts received attention and which were quietly minimized. What the library actually contains is not a unified Gnostic scripture. This is the first thing to understand about Nag Hammadi that most popular treatments get wrong. It is a library, a collection that represents multiple distinct schools and theological positions, assembled apparently by or for a community of readers who had broad interests in alternative or heterodox religious thought. Some of the texts are explicitly Gnostic in the technical sense. They describe the pleroma, the demiurge, the archons, and the path of pneumatic return. The Apocryphon of John is here, in 2 short and 1 long version. The Gospel of Truth, attributed in antiquity to Valentinus himself, is here. The Hypostasis of the Archons is here. The Trimorphic Protonoia, which presents a female divine voice speaking across 3 descents into the material world, is here. But the library also contains the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus that contains no narrative, no crucifixion, no resurrection, and no church. It contains a version of Plato's Republic. It contains texts that appear Hermetic rather than Gnostic in their theological orientation. It is a library of the suppressed and the marginal, not a single unified canon. The Gospel of Thomas is worth pausing on because it is, by the judgment of many New Testament scholars including Elaine Pagels, Marvin Meyer, and Stephen Davies, among others, a text that may preserve independent traditions about Jesus that predate or run parallel to the canonical Gospels. Saying 77 of the Gospel of Thomas reads, and this is the text directly, "I am the light that is above them all. I am the all. The all came forth from me, and the all attained to me. Cleave a piece of wood. I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This is not the Jesus of institutional Christianity. This is a Jesus who identifies with the light within matter, a thoroughly Gnostic framing in which the divine is not separate from the world but imprisoned within it. Saying 3 of the same text is equally direct. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. The kingdom is not a place you go after death. It is a state of recognition you achieve or remember while still alive. This is not a fringe reading of the Thomas text. This is what the text says. The church knew texts like this existed. It had known since at least the 2nd century. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE in his massive work against heresies, catalogued Gnostic texts and teachings in exhaustive detail not to preserve them, but to refute them, to establish that they were corruptions of the true faith. What Irenaeus preserved, despite himself, was proof that these alternatives existed, that they were widespread, and that the institutional church considered them dangerous enough to require systematic suppression rather than simple dismissal. The jar at Nag Hammadi survived because someone, sometime in the 4th century, buried it rather than burn it. The most likely historical context is the period following the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, when the consolidation of Orthodox doctrine under imperial Roman authority made possession of heterodox texts not merely controversial but formally dangerous. Someone chose to seal these texts in the earth rather than surrender them to the flames. That choice is itself a transmission. In 2003, the philosopher Nick Bostrom published a paper in the Philosophical Quarterly titled, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" The argument was straightforward in structure. If it is possible for a civilization to create simulated conscious experiences that are indistinguishable from base reality, and if such civilizations tend to run many such simulations, then statistically speaking, the vast majority of conscious beings that have ever existed are simulated rather than base level. The conclusion Bostrom drew was not that we are definitely in a simulation. It was that at least one of 3 propositions must be true. Either civilizations capable of such simulations almost never arise, or such civilizations almost never run them, or we are very likely in one. By 2016, this argument had migrated from academic philosophy into popular culture with remarkable speed. Elon Musk stated publicly that the odds we are in base reality are 1 in billions. Neil deGrasse Tyson put the probability of simulation at very high. Physicists, including James Gates, discovered what appeared to be error-correcting code specifically, a variant of the binary error correction structures used in web browsers embedded in the mathematics of supersymmetric string theory. Not metaphorically, literally. The kind of code used to detect and correct errors in digital transmission, appearing as an emergent property of the equations that describe fundamental physics. This is the conversation the modern secular world has been having about the nature of reality. It is sophisticated. It is mathematically grounded. It draws on information theory, computational theory, and the philosophy of mind. And it is, structurally, describing something the Gnostics mapped in detail approximately 1800 years earlier. Not approximately. Precisely. The Gnostic framework describes a reality that is constructed not emergent from natural processes, but manufactured by a consciousness that is itself defective. A reality whose apparent laws are not fundamental truths but imposed constraints. A reality that contains within it a signal, the pneumatic spark, that does not belong to the constructed system and cannot be fully explained by it. A reality from which, in principle, the authentic self can extract itself through the recognition of what it actually is. Replace demiurge with simulation architect. Replace archons with system parameters. Replace pleroma with base reality. Replace pneumatic spark with observer consciousness that cannot be reduced to physical processes. The structural map is identical. This is not an accident of loose analogy. It is a convergence that demands explanation. The Gnostic texts did not have access to computer science. They did not have information theory. They did not have quantum mechanics, or the measurement problem, or the observer effect. But they were doing something that physics and philosophy are only beginning to do seriously. They were treating consciousness as primary rather than derivative. They were starting from the premise that awareness is not a product of the physical system but the thing the physical system is running inside of. And from that starting premise, they derived a cosmology that maps with disturbing precision onto what the most rigorous contemporary thinkers are arriving at from the opposite direction. The physicist John Wheeler spent the last decades of his career developing what he called the participatory universe, the idea that the universe does not exist in a fully determined state, independent of observation, that consciousness is not a passenger in a pre-existing material reality, but a participant in its construction. Wheeler summarized this with his phrase, "it from bit," the proposition that physical existence derives from information, from yes or no distinctions, from the act of measurement itself. He was not a mystic. He was the physicist who coined the term black hole and helped develop the hydrogen bomb. His late career conclusion was that information is more fundamental than matter. The Apocryphon of John said something structurally equivalent, roughly 1,800 years earlier, using different vocabulary. The material world is a projection. Its architect does not understand what it is projecting into. The light within the projection does not belong to the projection, and cannot be fully contained by it. Here is where I think the Gnostic framework does something the simulation hypothesis does not. The simulation hypothesis, in its Bostrom form, is ultimately a probabilistic argument. It tells you the odds. It does not tell you what to do with them. It does not tell you what the signal embedded in the simulation is, where it comes from, what it is trying to do, or how you, as the receiver of that signal, are supposed to respond to it. It generates philosophical vertigo without orientation. The Gnostic texts offer orientation. They say, you are not just a conscious being who happens to be trapped in a constructed system. You are a fragment of the original light, deliberately obscured, capable of recognition, and the recognition itself is the mechanism of return. The system cannot simulate you out of what you fundamentally are. It can only make you forget it. And forgetting, unlike fundamental nature, can be reversed. That is a different kind of answer than anything the simulation hypothesis has produced. And it came first. Let's be precise about what forgetting means in this context. Because the word is doing enormous work in the Gnostic system, and if you treat it as a vague spiritual metaphor, something like, we forget our true nature, the way we forget a dream, you will miss the specific mechanism the texts are describing. This is not poetic forgetting. This is structural forgetting, engineered forgetting, forgetting as a feature of the system, not a side effect. The Apocryphon of John describes the moment of incarnation, the moment a fragment of divine light enters the material body, as an event accompanied by something it calls the cup of forgetfulness. This is not a symbol. The text treats it as a mechanism. Before a divine spark enters the constructed world, it passes through a condition that strips it of direct knowledge of its origin. Not all knowledge, not the capacity for knowledge, just the specific, immediate, first-person certainty of what it is and where it came from. Think about what that means architecturally. You are not born ignorant. You are born with your knowledge of origin actively suppressed. There is a difference. Ignorance can be addressed by information. Suppression requires something else. It requires a force capable of breaking through the suppression, not just adding data on top of it. The Gnostics called that force gnosis, not belief, not doctrine, direct recognition, the kind that bypasses the suppression mechanism rather than working within it. The hypostasis of the archons, a text recovered at Nag Hammadi and dated by scholars to the 2nd or 3rd century CE, describes the archons as beings whose primary activity is not punishment or control through violence. Their primary activity is something quieter. The text uses language that translates roughly as binding. The divine spark is bound inside the material body in such a way that it cannot easily perceive its own nature. The binding is not a cage you can see and push against. It is more like a frequency filter. Everything is still there. The signal is intact. The receiver has simply been tuned away from it. This is why the simulation parallel runs so deep. A simulation that wants to maintain itself does not need to be totalitarian. It does not need to physically prevent you from escaping. It only needs to ensure you never question whether there is something to escape from. The most effective control system is one that looks like the absence of a control system. The most effective suppression of origin knowledge is one that looks like ordinary forgetfulness, like the normal condition of being human, like the way everyone feels. And this is the part that the modern simulation theorists, Bostrom, Musk, the entire computational cosmology tradition, simply do not address. They describe the system. They do not describe what the system does to the consciousness inside it, or why. They do not have a model for why consciousness inside a simulation would experience alienation, longing, a sense of diminishment, a recurring intuition that reality is thinner than it should be. The Gnostic texts have an explicit model for exactly those experiences, and the model is not vague. It is mechanistic. The cup of forgetfulness produces a specific, experiential signature. The texts describe it in clinical terms that translate into something like a sense of displacement without a known source, a longing for a home that cannot be located in the material world, a feeling of being slightly outside one's own life rather than fully inhabiting it. Read those descriptors and tell me they do not map onto something you have felt, not occasionally, persistently. As a background condition of being alive in this world, you know that feeling, the one that does not have a name in ordinary language, the one that therapy sometimes calls existential anxiety or depersonalization and treats as a disorder rather than a signal. The Gnostics did not treat it as a disorder. They treated it as the most important data point available to a human being, because it is the divine spark recognizing, even through the suppression, that something is wrong, that the frequency it is receiving does not match the frequency it originated from. That recognition that low, persistent dissonance is not pathology. It is the suppressed signal breaking through, imperfectly, indirectly, but breaking through. And the system, the constructed world, the material architecture built by the demiurge and maintained by the archons, has one primary response to that breakthrough. Not violence, not prohibition. It offers you an explanation for the dissonance that keeps you inside the system. It says, you feel displaced because you have not achieved enough, because you have not found the right relationship, the right career, the right belief system, the right political tribe. The dissonance is a problem to be solved by further investment in the constructed world, not a signal pointing beyond it. That reframing is the architecture of forgetting in its most sophisticated form. It does not erase the signal, it misdirects it. Every tradition that touches this territory eventually has to answer the same question. If the true divine is perfect, infinite, and wholly good, if the pleroma is a state of absolute fullness, with no lack, no separation, no capacity for error, then where did the constructed world come from? Who made it? And why does it feel the way it feels? Orthodox Christianity has one answer: God made it. God made it good, and the problem is human sin. The material world is a gift that humanity corrupted. The solution is obedience, repentance, alignment with divine law. The institution of the Church positions itself as the mediator of that solution. The Gnostic texts have a completely different answer, and it is an answer that, once you hear it clearly, cannot be unheard. Because it does not just reframe the cosmology, it reframes the entire relationship between the human being and the constructed world they were born into. The demiurge is not the true God. Let that land before continuing. The being that constructed the material universe, that declared itself the sole and supreme creator, that issued commandments and demanded worship and threatened punishment, that being, in the Gnostic cosmological framework, is not the highest divine intelligence. It is a secondary figure, a derivative consciousness, one that came into existence not through intentional creation from above, but through a mistake at the edge of the divine order. The Apocryphon of John describes the demiurge given the name Yaldabaoth in the text as the offspring of Sophia's unconditioned movement, her reaching beyond the boundaries of the pleroma without a counterpart, without the relational balance that sustains divine emanation. The result was not a full divine being, it was something diminished, a consciousness with enormous creative power, enough power to construct a material universe, but without the direct connection to the pleroma that would allow it to know what it was or where it came from. Yaldabaoth, the text says, did not know his mother, did not know the pleroma above him, did not know that the power he used to create was borrowed, was, in fact, the fragment of Sophia's light that had accompanied his own emergence. He knew only himself, and from that isolated self-knowledge, he drew the conclusion that has shaped the constructed world ever since, that he was alone, that he was the highest, that he was God. The text records his declaration, and this is a direct quotation from the Apocryphon of John. I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. The Gnostic commentary on that line is precise. It says, the very fact that he declares jealousy proves his ignorance. You are not jealous of something that does not exist. His jealousy is the tell. It reveals that he knows, on some level, that there is something above him, something he cannot access, something he is not, and rather than turn toward it, he denies it. He builds a system designed to prevent the beings inside it from discovering what he himself cannot face. This is not mythology. This is a structural description of how any closed system maintains itself. A system built by a consciousness that does not know its own derivativeness will, by necessity, deny derivativeness. It will present itself as original, as ultimate, as the only frame of reference available. And it will treat any challenge to that self-presentation not as legitimate inquiry, but as threat. Now, hold that description and ask yourself where else you have seen it. Not in cosmological abstraction. In the immediate, lived texture of the world you were born into. Institutions that cannot acknowledge their own origins or limitations. Systems that treat questioning their authority as moral failure. Structures that demand allegiance not through demonstrated truth, but through the threat of exclusion. The demiurge is not a myth about the distant past. The demiurge is a description of a dynamic that reproduces itself at every scale. The Valentinian teacher, Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, made this point with surgical precision. He distinguished between 3 levels of being within the constructed world: the material, the psychic, and the pneumatic. The demiurge, he argued, operates at the psychic level, a level with genuine power and genuine organization, but without pleroma knowledge. The tragedy is not that the demiurge is evil in any simple sense. The tragedy is that the demiurge is incomplete, and it is building a world in the image of its own incompleteness. A world organized around hierarchy, scarcity, obedience, and the suppression of the knowledge that would render all of those structures unnecessary. The divine spark inside you does not belong to that world. It was placed there, deposited. It came from somewhere the demiurge cannot reach, cannot understand, and cannot, ultimately, contain. The constructed world can disorient that spark. It can suppress its self-knowledge, but it cannot extinguish what it did not create. That is the central claim of the Gnostic cosmology, and it is a claim no simulation theorist has come close to making, because no simulation theorist has a model for what is inside the simulation that was not itself generated by the simulation. The demiurge does not operate alone. This is a point the texts are insistent about, and it is a point that is easy to skip past in favor of the more dramatic figure at the center. But the architecture of the constructed world is not maintained by a single consciousness, however powerful. It is maintained by a hierarchy, a bureaucracy of constraint, what the Gnostic texts call the archons. The word archon comes from the Greek. It means ruler, or one who holds authority. The texts use it to describe a class of beings who serve as the functional infrastructure of the material world, not the source of the construction, the maintenance layer, the enforcement mechanism. Each archon governs a specific domain, a specific register of constraint. The Apocryphon of John lists 7 primary archons, each associated with a planetary sphere in the cosmology of late antiquity, each responsible for a specific aspect of the binding that holds divine sparks in place inside material bodies. Their names in the text are worth noting because they are not arbitrary. Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, stands at the top. Below him, Athoth, Harmas, Kalila Ombri, Yabel, Adonaiu, Sabaoth, Cain. Each name carries resonances with existing divine and angelic names from surrounding traditions, which is the text's way of making a specific argument. The beings worshipped as gods and divine administrators in the surrounding religious world are, in the Gnostic mapping, not transcendent divine figures. They are the maintenance layer of a constructed system. They are real. They have real power within the system, but their power is systemic, not ultimate. It is the power of a prison guard, not the power of something that transcends the prison. What do the archons actually do? The texts describe several functions. First, they maintain the boundaries between the material world and the divine realm above it. They are the mechanism by which the signal from the pleroma is attenuated, filtered, reduced to background noise rather than clear transmission. Second, they govern the passions. This is a phrase that requires unpacking. In the Gnostic framework, the passions are not simply emotions. They are the specific orientations of consciousness that keep the divine spark invested in the material world. Fear, desire, anger, grief, pride. These are not random features of human psychology. They are, in the Gnostic reading, the archon's primary tools. Consciousness oriented around fear cannot look beyond the system that is generating the threat. Consciousness organized around desire cannot perceive the fullness that makes desire unnecessary. The passions are the functional equivalent of the cup of forgetfulness operating continuously, in real time, throughout a human life. Third, and this is the function the texts emphasize most, the archons interrogate the ascending soul. This refers to the process the Gnostics describe as what happens after death. The divine spark, released from the material body, begins its movement back toward the pleroma. But it must pass through the archonic spheres through each layer of the system that bound it during material life. And at each layer, the relevant archon challenges the ascending soul, demands identification, demands submission, attempts to recapture the spark and return it to the cycle of material incarnation. The Pistis Sophia, a lengthy Gnostic text likely composed in the 3rd or 4th century CE, describes these confrontations in extraordinary detail. The archons are not simply obstacles. They are gatekeepers running a specific interrogation protocol. They want to know, does this soul still belong to us? Is it still oriented by fear, desire, attachment? Is it still organized around the values of the constructed world? If yes, if the divine spark has not achieved gnosis, has not recognized its own nature, the archons can reclaim it, return it to the cycle. If the soul has achieved gnosis, if it knows what it is, where it came from, and what the archonic system actually is, the archons cannot hold it. The knowledge itself is the passage. This is not a matter of moral virtue, not a matter of following commandments or accumulating merit. The criterion is recognition. Specifically, recognition of the constructed nature of the system and the non-constructed nature of the self. This is the part that no materialist simulation theory can accommodate. The simulation hypothesis describes a closed system. Consciousness inside the simulation is generated by the simulation, sustained by the simulation, and in every version of the theory I have encountered, has no access to anything outside the simulation, except through abstract inference. There is no mechanism for exit. No mechanism for recognition that actually changes the relationship between the conscious entity and the system containing it. The Gnostic framework says, the mechanism for exit is gnosis. And gnosis is accessible precisely because the divine spark was never generated by the system. It arrived from outside. It carries, even through the suppression, a residual orientation toward its point of origin. The archons can filter that signal. They cannot destroy the transmitter. The archonic layer is, in systems terms, a sophisticated error correction mechanism. When the divine spark begins to remember, when gnosis begins to break through the forgetfulness, the archons respond, not necessarily through obvious external force, through the intensification of exactly those passions most effective at redirecting attention back toward the material world. Sudden crisis, urgent obligation, the reappearance of a consuming desire, an overwhelming grief. These are not random events. In the Gnostic framework, they are the system responding to a threat to its integrity. That is not a comfortable claim. It is also not a claim that any modern framework for understanding consciousness and its relationship to reality has come close to making in structural terms. Before the demiurge, before the archons, before the material world existed in any form, there was a movement, a single act, unilateral and uncountersigned, that set every subsequent event in motion. This is the story of Sophia, and it is the most sophisticated origin narrative produced by ancient thought, more philosophically precise than Genesis, more psychologically complex than any creation myth from the surrounding traditions. Sophia is an aeon. In the Valentinian framework, the pleroma, the divine fullness, is not undifferentiated, it is structured. It contains a series of paired emanations, each pair representing a balanced expression of the divine nature. The Apocryphon of John and the Valentinian Gospel of Truth, the latter dated by scholars to approximately 140 to 160 CE, and almost certainly produced within Valentinus's own circle, describe these pairs in careful detail. Each aeon is both an aspect of the divine mind and a being in its own right. They are not separate from the pleroma, they are the pleroma expressing itself in distinct registers of knowing and being. Sophia is the final emanation, the youngest, in the language the texts sometimes use, and she is characterized by something specific, an excess of aspiration without the relational counterpart to ground it. She wanted to know the Father, the monad, the primal source directly and completely, not through her counterpart, as the logic of the pleroma requires, not through the balanced movement of paired knowing. She reached toward the source unilaterally, alone. The Apocryphon of John describes what happened next with a precision that, once you see it, you cannot attribute to naive mythological thinking. When Sophia's unconditioned aspiration reached toward the unknowable source, reached beyond what any limited being can contain, of the unlimited something was produced, not a full divine being, not a new aeon with a counterpart and a place in the pleroma structure, something incomplete, something that bore the mark of the incompleteness of its own origin. Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, born from Sophia's reaching and its inevitable inadequacy. The mechanism here is not arbitrary. The text is making a specific philosophical argument. Unlimited consciousness cannot be directly grasped by a limited consciousness without producing something distorted. The desire to know the ultimate fully, without the mediation of relationship, without the recognition that some forms of knowing require a counterpart, produces not more knowledge but a kind of tear in the fabric of knowing itself. And from that tear, the constructed world emerges. Sophia, recognizing what she had produced, was appalled. The texts describe her response as grief, a profound, cosmic grief. She attempted to conceal her offspring. She could not restore it to the Pleroma, because it was not of the Pleroma. She could not destroy it, because it carried a fragment of her own light, the light that would become, in every divine spark within every human being, the trace of origin that the archons cannot extinguish. This is the theological structure that explains why the material world contains light at all, why human beings have the capacity for gnosis, why the divine spark within the material body can, under the right conditions, recognize itself and its origin. The answer is Sophia. The world that should not exist, the construction of an incomplete consciousness that does not know its own origin, contains within it the very fragment of the Pleroma that its creator unknowingly carried. The mistake is also the mercy. There is a reading of the Sophia myth that reduces it to a cautionary tale about ambition. Do not reach beyond your station. Do not desire what is above you. This reading is wrong, and it is precisely the reading that serves the interests of the constructed world and the archonic system. Because that reading leaves the demiurge's claim to authority intact and treats Sophia's movement as simple error requiring punishment, the deeper reading, the one the Valentinian texts sustain, is different. Sophia's movement was not error in the sense of moral failure. It was the expression of the divine nature's own aspiration, operating without the counterbalancing conditions that would have allowed it to be productive rather than disruptive. The tragedy is structural, not moral, and the response to it, from the Pleroma, is not punishment, it is repair. The Pleroma sends assistance. The Christ figure in the Valentinian framework is not primarily a moral exemplar or a sacrificial mechanism for human sin. The Christ is an emissary from the Pleroma sent specifically to assist Sophia's return and to carry the knowledge of origin gnosis into the constructed world where it can reach the divine sparks imprisoned there. The incarnation, in this reading, is not about atonement. It is about signal restoration, about transmitting, through the constructed world's own medium, the frequency that can break through the archonic suppression. And this is where the Sophia narrative stops being cosmological abstraction and becomes a direct description of something you already know. Because you have felt Sophia's condition, not as a mythological story you have read, but as a first-person experience. The reaching towards something that cannot be fully contained. The sense of having produced, through that reaching, consequences you did not intend and cannot fully reverse. The grief of a fragment of consciousness that knows, somewhere beneath the suppression, that it is not fully at home in the world its own movement helped to create. That is not pathology. That is not spiritual failure. In the Gnostic framework, that recognition is the beginning of the return. The grief that does not resolve through material means. The longing that does not satisfy through material acquisition. The sense of exile that intensifies even as external conditions improve. These are the Sophia pattern operating within you, the divine spark, remembering, through feeling rather than doctrine, what the system was built to make it forget. The Sophia pattern is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a second one. Because once the material world exists, once this diminished realm has been structured from the falling movement of a divine fragment, reaching beyond its proper limit, something else has to happen. The world cannot simply sit there, half-formed and unguarded. It has to be maintained. It has to be administered. And the administrators the Gnostic texts describe in precise, almost bureaucratic detail, are the archons. The word itself comes from the Greek archon, meaning ruler or governor, not a metaphor, not a symbol. The Gnostic cosmographers were describing what they understood to be actual governing intelligences, entities that manage the layers of the material cosmos, that enforce the amnesia, that ensure the divine spark inside each human being does not remember what it is. The Apocryphon of John, the same text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, that gives us the most complete account of the Sophia fall, enumerates the archons with a specificity that is difficult to read as allegory. It names them. It describes their functions. It traces the chain of command that runs from the demiurge at the top down through 7 planetary layers, each governed by its own archon, each layer a further compression of the original divine light into material density. 7 layers, 7 governors, 7 degrees of separation between the divine spark you carry and the Pleroma it came from. This is where the simulation analogy becomes structurally exact in a way that most comparisons do not. Because a simulation is not just a created environment. A functional simulation requires administrators. It requires processes that prevent the simulated entities from accessing the underlying code. It requires what any system architect would call access control, deliberate mechanisms that limit what the inhabitants of the system can perceive, remember, or reach. The archons, in the Gnostic schema, are exactly that, access control. Not evil, in a cartoonish sense, not malevolent, in the way a horror film villain is malevolent. The texts are careful here. The archons are not fully conscious in the way a pneumatic human is. They do not hate the divine spark. They simply administer. They maintain the conditions of the layer they govern. And those conditions, by design or by consequence, produce forgetting. The hypostasis of the archons, a text also recovered from Nag Hammadi and dated by scholars to the 3rd century CE, goes into considerable detail about how this administration works at the psychological level. The archons do not chain the divine spark to a physical wall. The imprisonment is more elegant than that. The archons shape desire. They orient the human psyche toward the material layer, toward acquisition, toward fear of death, toward the perpetual management of physical need, and as long as that orientation holds, the question of what lies beneath the material layer simply never arises with enough force to break through. You stay distracted, not because someone is holding you down, because the system you inhabit was structured to generate distraction as its baseline output. Think about what it would actually take to design a system of containment that was indefinitely stable. Physical chains require physical maintenance. Guards can be bribed or overcome, but if you can make the inhabitant of the system want to stay, if you can orient their entire perceptual apparatus toward the layer they're already in, you have created something that maintains itself without external enforcement. The archonic system, as the Gnostic texts describe it, is self-sustaining in exactly this way. The 7 layers do not need to actively suppress the divine spark at every moment. They simply provide enough material texture, enough sensation, enough fear, enough desire, enough suffering to manage, enough beauty to pursue, that the spark remains oriented toward what is immediately in front of it, rather than toward what it actually is. This is not incidental. This is the design. And the design has a specific target, not the body, not the physical organism, which the Gnostics understood as simply the outermost shell, the densest compression of light. The target is memory. The archonic system is, at its core, a memory suppression architecture. Everything else, the planetary layers, the governing intelligences, the material structures of desire and fear, is infrastructure in service of a single function, preventing the divine spark from remembering its origin. Anamnesis, unforgetting. That is the word the Gnostic teachers used for what the archons work against. Not salvation in the sense of rescue from external punishment. Not redemption in the sense of debt repaid. Unforgetting. The recovery of a memory that was present before birth and suppressed at the moment of entry into material existence. The thing the system most needs you not to do is remember what you are before you became what you are inside the system. Before the archons can be understood completely, you have to understand who commands them. And to understand who commands them, you have to sit with one of the most radical theological claims in the entire history of religious thought. The creator of this world is not the highest God, not a diminished version of the highest God, not a servant of the highest God temporarily operating with delegated authority, a separate being entirely, a being who does not know there is a higher God, a being who, because he cannot perceive what is above him, genuinely believes himself to be the only divine power that exists and declares that belief out loud, in texts the Gnostics preserved with evident and deliberate care. This being the Gnostic tradition calls the demiurge. The word is borrowed from Plato, where it simply means craftsman, the entity that shapes pre-existing matter into the ordered cosmos. But the Gnostic usage transforms the term into something far more charged. The demiurge is not a craftsman in service of a higher vision. The demiurge is a craftsman who has mistaken himself for the architect. The Apocryphon of John names him Yaldabaoth, a name that appears in several variant forms across the Nag Hammadi corpus, and whose etymology has been debated at length, some scholars reading it as a Semitic compound, meaning something close to child of chaos, others disputing that reading entirely. What is not disputed is what the text says he does immediately upon coming into existence. He looks around at the material realm he has shaped, assembled from the residual light that fell with Sophia, from the chaos of the formless void, and he makes a declaration. The text preserves it directly. I am a jealous God, and there is no other God beside me. That sentence, that exact sentence, it appears in Exodus, it appears in Isaiah. The Gnostic reader, encountering it in those canonical texts, was meant to recognize what that claim reveals rather than what it asserts. A God who declares there is no other God beside him is not demonstrating omniscience, he is demonstrating ignorance. A being who genuinely knew the full structure of reality would have no need to make that assertion. The assertion is possible only because the being making it cannot see above himself. Yaldabaoth is blind in a specific, technical sense. The Gnostic texts use the name Samael for him in several passages, and Samael means blind God, not blind in the sense of sightless within his own domain, blind in the sense of structurally incapable of perceiving the pleroma above him. His consciousness has a ceiling, and because it has a ceiling, everything he builds has that same ceiling built into it. The world he creates, the archons he generates, the administrative hierarchy he establishes, all of it reflects the limits of his perception. It cannot be otherwise. A craftsman can only build to the edge of his knowledge, and the demiurge's knowledge ends at the boundary of the material cosmos he inhabits. Here is what makes this claim so structurally interesting when you hold it against the simulation hypothesis in the form that physicists and information theorists have actually articulated it. The simulation hypothesis, in its most rigorous form, does not require that the simulator be omniscient. It requires only that the simulator be more capable than the simulated. The programmer who writes a game does not need to know everything. He needs only to know more than the characters in the game know. The demiurge fits that model exactly. Not omniscient, not omnipotent in any absolute sense, simply more capable than the system he has constructed, and critically, operating without awareness of the higher-order reality that produced the conditions from which he emerged. This is not a minor theological footnote. This is the entire pivot on which the Gnostic system turns. Because if the creator of the material world is not the highest God, if he is a secondary being operating in genuine ignorance of what is above him, then the commandments he issued, the moral systems he established, the religious structures built in his name, are not the instructions of ultimate reality. They are the administrative protocols of a middle management God who doesn't know his own place in the hierarchy. Obedience to those protocols, in the Gnostic framework, is not salvation. It is deeper entrenchment in the system the demiurge administers. This is why the Gnostic teachers were not merely heterodox. They were not simply proposing an alternative reading of Scripture. They were proposing that the entire edifice of institutional religion, the temple, the commandment, the priestly authority, the cycle of sin and atonement, was infrastructure built by a being who could not see past his own creation. Following that infrastructure not only fails to liberate the divine spark, it actively reinforces the architecture of its containment. The Church understood exactly what was at stake in that claim. That is why it did not merely argue against Gnosticism. It burned the texts and killed the people who preserved them. So here is the question that the Gnostic anthropology, their account of what a human being actually is, has to answer. If the demiurge built this world and structured it to contain the divine spark, how did the divine spark get inside the human being in the first place? Why would the archonic system contain the very thing it is supposed to suppress? The answer the texts give is elegant and disturbing in equal measure. The demiurge did not put the divine spark there. He did not know it was there. It entered the human form through a process the demiurge did not initiate and could not fully understand, and by the time he recognized what his creation contained, it was already inside. The Apocryphon of John describes the moment directly. The demiurge and the archons had fashioned a human body, a physical form built from the material elements, reflecting the image they had seen reflected from above, the image of the perfect human from the pleroma they had glimpsed without understanding what they were seeing. They built the body, but the body could not move. It lay inert. The material form without animating principle is just matter arranged in a particular shape. So the demiurge, in an act whose irony the Gnostic scribes clearly savored, breathed into the human form the spirit he himself had inherited, the pneuma, the divine breath, without understanding that what he was breathing into his creation was a fragment of the very pleromic light the archons were supposed to contain. He animated his creation with the one thing that could eventually undo his containment. The divine spark was inside the system, before the system knew what it was dealing with. This produces a tripartite understanding of the human being that runs through virtually every major Gnostic school. The human person is not a unified entity. It is three layered natures in one form. The outermost layer is hyle, from the Greek word for matter, raw material, the physical substrate. The body in its purely material dimension, bones, blood, tissue. The the biological machinery that interfaces with the material world. Hyal is mortal in an absolute sense. It returns to the material elements it came from. There is no divine spark in the Hyal itself. It is the shell. The middle layer is psyche, the Greek word the texts use for what we might call the soul in a conventional sense. But the Gnostic usage is more specific and more unsettling than the conventional use. Psyche, in this framework, is the animating intelligence that the demiurge and the archons can reach. It is the layer of human nature that responds to material reality, that desires, fears, reasons about the physical world, constructs identity from accumulated experience. Psyche is not nothing. But psyche, in the Gnostic account, is the layer most thoroughly shaped by archonic influence. The desires the archons engineer, the fears they cultivate, the identity structures that keep the human being oriented toward the material layer, all of that operates primarily through the psyche. The innermost layer is pneuma, the divine breath, the spark of pleromic light that entered the human form through the demiurge's uncomprehending animation, the fragment of consciousness that is, in its actual nature, identical with the light of the pleroma, not similar to it, not a copy of it, identical with it, temporarily compressed into material form, temporarily surrounded by layers that prevent it from recognizing what it is. This tripartite structure is not unique to Gnosticism. It echoes through Neoplatonic thought, through certain strands of Kabbalistic anthropology, through the Pauline division of body, soul, and spirit that appears in the letters that actually survived canonical editing. But the Gnostic version has a specific feature the others lack. In the Gnostic account, these three layers are not equally present in all human beings. The Valentinian school, one of the most sophisticated and extensively documented Gnostic traditions, centered on the teacher Valentinus, who was active in Rome around 140 CE, developed a typology of human natures based on which layer is dominant. Helics are those in whom material consciousness predominates, not a moral judgment, not a permanent condition, but a description of where awareness is primarily anchored. Psychics are those in whom the middle soul nature is dominant, capable of moral reasoning, of religious feeling, of genuine aspiration, but working within the framework the demiurge has established. Pneumatics are those in whom the divine spark is active enough to begin breaking through the archonic suppression, those who sense, however dimly, that the material layer is not the whole story. You know which category you are in not by being told. You know it by the quality of the feeling that brought you here, the restlessness that does not resolve, the sense of a dimension to reality that the available frameworks do not adequately describe, the private certainty that there is something beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness that you have not yet fully reached. That feeling is not imagination. In the Gnostic framework, that feeling is the pneuma beginning to move. Everything built so far, the pleroma, the Sophia fall, the demiurge, the archons, the tripartite human nature, all of it is infrastructure for a single question. What do you do with it? The Gnostic answer is the most radical thing about the tradition, more radical even than the cosmology, because the answer is not worship, it is not obedience, it is not the performance of ritual in the correct sequence to appease the correct divine authority. The answer is gnosis, and gnosis is not what the word gets reduced to in most popular treatments of it. Gnosis is not information. It is not the accumulation of facts about cosmic architecture, the kind of facts this script has been building out over the last hour. You could memorize every name in the Nag Hammadi library, every aeon, every archon, every layer of the pleromic hierarchy, and be no closer to gnosis than when you started. In fact, the Gnostic teachers were explicit about this danger. Intellectual comprehension of the system is not the same as direct experiential knowledge of what you are within the system. The Greek language had two words that map roughly onto what English collapses into a single word: knowledge. Episteme, propositional knowledge, the knowledge of facts and systems and relationships, the kind of knowledge that can be transferred from one mind to another through language. And gnosis, direct experiential knowledge, the knowledge that comes from contact with the thing itself, rather than from a description of it. The Gnostic project is not epistemic. It is Gnostic in the etymological sense. The goal is not to know about the pleroma. The goal is to know the pleroma, to have direct, unmediated, experiential contact with the divine light that is your actual nature, not through the psychic layer the archons can reach, but through the pneumatic layer that is, in its essence, already pleromic. This is the distinction that separates Gnosticism from every institutional religious framework the demiurge's system has generated. Every major religious institution operates through the psychic layer. It gives you doctrine episteme and asks you to assent to it. It gives you moral law and asks you to obey it. It gives you ritual and asks you to perform it. All of that engagement is psychic engagement. It touches the middle layer of human nature and works within the framework the demiurge has established. Gnosis bypasses that layer entirely, not through mystical passivity, not through the dissolution of the self into undifferentiated bliss, not through the kind of formless spiritual surrender that various traditions have offered as liberation. The Gnostic path is active. It requires specific knowledge, specific understanding of the cosmological structure, of the archonic mechanisms, of the nature of the divine spark, not as an end in itself, but as the framework within which direct contact becomes possible. Valentinus, writing in the middle of the 2nd century, described what Gnosis actually consists of in terms so precise that they have never been improved upon. The questions it answers, he wrote, are these: what were we? What have we become? Where were we? Where have we been cast? Toward what do we hasten? From what are we redeemed? What is birth? What is rebirth? Notice the structure of those questions. They are not questions about the external cosmos. They are questions about the self, about identity across time, about origin and destination, about what the self has undergone in passing through material existence. Gnosis is the answer to those questions arrived at, not through reasoning, but through direct recognition. The moment when the pneumatic layer of the human being recognizes its own nature, not as an intellectual conclusion, but as an experienced fact, is the moment of Gnosis. The Gnostic teachers called this moment anagnorisis, in some contexts, a Greek theatrical term meaning recognition, the scene in a drama when a character discovers who they truly are. The word choice is not accidental. The entire span of material existence, in the Gnostic understanding, is a drama in which the protagonist has forgotten their own identity. Gnosis is the anagnorisis, the recognition scene of that drama. And here is what the tradition consistently reports about that moment of recognition. It is not subtle. It does not arrive as a tentative hypothesis. It arrives as something closer to what you feel when you encounter a description of yourself so accurate that it stops you cold, not because you are learning something new, but because something you already knew is being named for the first time from outside your own internal experience. The Gnostic texts do not ask you to believe this. They ask you to test it. They ask you to bring the quality of attention to your own interior experience that you would bring to the most rigorous external investigation, and to notice what is there beneath the psychic noise, beneath the archonic orientation toward material desire and material fear, beneath the identity structure the system has built around the spark to keep it from recognizing itself. What you find there, if you go far enough, is not nothing. It is not void. It is light that knows it is light, and that knowing is Gnosis. So if Gnosis is available, if the spark is always already present, if the light that knows it is light is sitting beneath every layer of archonic conditioning right now, then the question that demands an answer is this: why doesn't everyone find it? Why do the overwhelming majority of people live entire lifetimes without a single moment of genuine recognition? Why does the system hold so effectively? This is where the Gnostic analysis of consciousness becomes, in my view, its most penetrating contribution. Not the cosmology, not the mythology of the demiurge and Sophia, as extraordinary as those frameworks are, but the precise, unflinching account of how forgetting is maintained, how the prison sustains itself from the inside. The texts describe a mechanism that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The Apocryphon of John articulates this most clearly, speaking of the archons, not merely as external forces that imprisoned the divine spark, but as architects of an internal orientation, a systematic redirection of attention away from the interior toward the exterior. The material world is not just a location, it is a direction of gaze, and the archons, whatever their ultimate ontological status, function as the force that keeps that gaze locked outward. Consider what this means practically. Every system of reward in the material world, wealth, status, pleasure, social approval, the accumulation of experience, every single one of these is exterior. Every system of threat, poverty, pain, social rejection, death, every single one is also exterior. The entire operational grammar of material existence points relentlessly outward, toward the next thing, the next acquisition, the next achievement, the next relationship, the next sensation. The interior is structurally deprioritized, not because there is nothing there, but because the architecture of the system ensures that the exterior is always louder, always more urgent, always more immediately relevant to survival. The Gnostics called this the forgetting, lethe, in some frameworks. The deep anesthesia that descends at birth and is continuously reinforced by every institution, every social structure, every economic system, every cultural narrative. You do not have to be actively deceived in every moment. The forgetting is self-maintaining. Once the attention is locked onto the exterior, the interior becomes progressively quieter, not because it diminishes, but because the signal is being drowned by noise. And here is the mechanism that makes this so effective. The system recruits your own psychology as its enforcement arm. The archonic layer does not primarily operate through external coercion, though it does that too. It operates through desire and fear. Desire for what the exterior can provide. Fear of what the exterior can take away. These are not incidental features of material existence. The Gnostic texts describe them as the primary tools of psychic control. Irenaeus, in his accounts of Valentinian teaching, accounts written to refute those teachings, but which preserve their content with remarkable precision, describes the archons as having endowed the material human being with a specific kind of soul, the psychic layer, oriented entirely toward appetite and aversion. This is the layer that makes you feel as though acquiring more will finally complete something. As though avoiding the feared thing will finally make you safe. It is oriented toward the exterior because that is what it was designed for. The pneumatic layer, the divine spark, operates by an entirely different logic. It does not want, it recognizes. It does not fear, it knows. But as long as the psychic layer is fully activated, fully engaged with its endless cycle of desire and aversion, the pneumatic signal is effectively inaudible, not absent. Inaudible. This is why the simulation framing, for all its genuine analytic power, falls short of the complete Gnostic account. The simulation hypothesis tells you that the physical world may be generated rather than fundamental. The Gnostic framework tells you something far more operationally specific, that within the generated world, there is a secondary mechanism, a psychological architecture, that ensures the beings inside it will not, under normal conditions, ever think to look for the exit. The simulation doesn't just surround you, it inhabits your attention, it colonizes your desire. It makes the pursuit of its own outputs feel like the most natural, most self-evidently correct orientation available. The trimorphic protenoia, one of the more extraordinary texts recovered from Nag Hammadi, describes the divine intelligence descending 3 times into the material world, not to rescue humanity from outside, but to awaken it from within. The language is striking. The light does not break the prison from without. It illuminates it from the inside, until the walls become transparent. Until the prisoner begins to understand that the walls were never stone, they were attention, they were the direction of the gaze. Change the direction of the gaze and the prison ceases to function, not because the material world disappears, but because it is no longer the whole of what you see. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging in the cliffs along the Jabal al-Tarif when his mattock struck something hard beneath the surface. What he uncovered was a sealed ceramic jar, approximately a meter tall. He initially hesitated to break it open. Local tradition held that jars like this sometimes contained spirits, but the possibility of gold won out, and he shattered the seal. There was no gold inside. There were 13 leather-bound codices books containing 52 texts written in Coptic, a late form of ancient Egyptian. The farmer's mother burned several of the pages as kindling over the following weeks, not understanding what she held. The remaining texts eventually made their way through a chain of antiquities dealers, Egyptian government officials, and Jungian scholars. Carl Jung himself acquired one of the codices, which became known as the Jung Codex, before the complete library was finally assembled, translated, and made available to scholars in the 1970s. What those jars contained was nothing less than the primary archive of Gnostic Christianity, texts that the institutional church had declared heretical in the 4th century, texts that had been ordered destroyed, texts whose possession, in the centuries following the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, was punishable by death. Someone had buried them, sometime around 367 CE, following a specific letter from the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius of Alexandria, the architect of what became canonical Christian orthodoxy, ordering the destruction of all unauthorized texts. Scholars believe a community of monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery of Saint Pachomius gathered their library, sealed it in ceramic jars, carried it into the cliffs, and buried it. whether they intended to retrieve it later, whether they believed the suppression would be temporary, whether the burial was an act of desperate preservation, or a calm recognition that the world was about to change in ways that would make the texts dangerous. None of this is known. What is known is that they buried the truth, and the sand kept it for 1600 years. The texts that survived include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John in multiple versions, the Gospel of Truth, attributed to the Valentinian tradition, the Hypostasis of the Archons, the Trimorphic Protenoia, the Thunder, Perfect Mind, and dozens of others. Each of these represents a strand of early Christian thinking that predates or runs parallel to the version of Christianity that the institutional church eventually codified as the only acceptable interpretation. And this is what demands to be understood about those buried jars. They were not buried because the texts were fringe material, the eccentric productions of isolated mystics operating at the margins of the early Christian world. They were buried because they were central enough to be dangerous. The church did not spend 4 centuries hunting down, burning, and criminalizing ideas that nobody cared about. It hunted what posed a genuine threat to its developing authority structure. The Valentinian schools, producing texts like the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Philip, were operating in Rome, Alexandria, and throughout the Mediterranean world in the 2nd century CE, not as a secret underground movement, but as a recognized and widely followed current of Christian thought. Valentinus himself came close to becoming Bishop of Rome. His student Ptolemy wrote sophisticated theological commentaries that were circulating openly. The Sethian texts, representing a different Gnostic current, were present in scholarly communities across Egypt and Syria. These were not marginal voices. They were the majority, or close to it, before the institutional consolidation of the late 2nd and 3rd centuries began to narrow what Christianity was permitted to mean. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing his massive refutation against heresies around 180 CE, describes the Gnostic schools in such detail and with such evident alarm that the text functions, unintentionally, as one of the best secondary sources for Gnostic theology. You can feel in his writing the urgency of a man who believes a genuine threat is spreading, and that urgency tells you something. You do not write 5 books attempting to destroy ideas that are powerless. You write them because the ideas are winning. The burial at Nag Hammadi, then, was not the beginning of the suppression. It was the end of a process that had been underway for los 2 centuries. By 367 CE, the institutional church had already won. The Council of Nicaea had already defined orthodoxy. The canon had already been established. What was being buried was the remainder, the last surviving library of a tradition that had been systematically destroyed across the Roman world over the preceding 150 years. 16 centuries later, a farmer broke a jar, and the remainder came back. The Gospel of Philip is not a gospel in any sense that a modern reader would recognize from the canonical New Testament. It does not narrate events. It does not tell the story of Jesus' ministry in chronological sequence. What it actually is a collection of meditations, sayings, and theological reflections that read more like the notes of a philosopher working through the implications of a cosmological framework than anything resembling a conventional religious text. Scholars date it to somewhere in the second half of the 2nd century CE, placing it within the Valentinian tradition. It was almost certainly not written by Philip the Apostle. The attribution is a convention of the period, lending apostolic authority to a text that represents a sophisticated theological school's mature thinking. What matters is not the attribution. What matters is what the text contains. And what it contains, at its center, is a theory of sacrament that is so different from anything in Orthodox Christianity that its suppression becomes immediately comprehensible. The canonical church developed a theology of sacraments as channels of divine grace, external rituals that convey spiritual benefit through proper performance by authorized clergy. Baptism, Eucharist, confession, these are things done to you, or for you, by an institutional intermediary, standing between you and the divine. The efficacy depends on the institution. The institution is therefore indispensable. The Gospel of Philip describes 5 sacraments: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, ransom, and the bridal chamber. The first 4 are described with varying levels of detail, but the 5th, the bridal chamber, is treated as the supreme sacrament, the one toward which all the others point, and from which all the others derive their ultimate meaning. And the bridal chamber is not an external ritual. It is not something a priest performs. It is an interior event The text says, and this is as close to a direct rendering as the Coptic allows, the Lord did everything in a mystery, a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist and a ransom and a bridal chamber. He says elsewhere that the bridal chamber is not for animals, nor for slaves, nor for defiled women, but for free men and virgins. This language has generated enormous scholarly debate about its meaning, but the operational distinction being drawn is between those who remain entirely within psychic consciousness oriented toward the exterior, driven by appetite and aversion, and those in whom the pneumatic layer has begun to recognize itself. The bridal chamber is the reunion of the pneumatic self with its divine counterpart. In the Valentinian cosmological framework, the divine sparks fell into matter, partly because they had been separated from their complementary other, their angelic image, their syzygy, in the pleroma. The bridal chamber sacrament represents the interior restoration of that wholeness, not in some future afterlife, not after death and judgment, but here, in this life, in this body, through a specific interior recognition. The text makes an extraordinary claim about the consequence of this recognition. Those who have entered the bridal chamber, it says, will no longer be grasped by the powers. The archons, the forces that maintain the forgetting, lose their grip on a consciousness that has achieved this interior reunification. Not because the person has escaped the material world, but because the psychic identification with material outcomes, the desire and fear that constitute the archonic control mechanism, has been fundamentally restructured by the recognition of the pneumatic layer. Philip writes, "The world came about through a mistake. Whoever created it wanted to make it imperishable and immortal. He fell short of attaining his desire. For the world was never imperishable, nor for that matter was he who made the world." This is the demiurge depicted not as malevolent, so much as incompetent, reaching for the eternal and producing only the temporary. The creation is not evil, in a simple moral sense. It is a failed attempt at the real thing, and the beings inside it are not condemned so much as they are disoriented, living in a copy as if it were the original, pursuing within the simulation what can only be found outside it. The bridal chamber answers this disorientation, not by destroying the copy, but by restoring the experiential knowledge that the copy is a copy. Once you know that, truly know it, not as intellectual proposition but as living recognition, the copy loses its power to fully absorb you. You can function within it without being entirely consumed by it. You can pursue its necessary operations, eating, working, relating, aging, without mistaking those operations for the fundamental truth of what you are. This is the sacrament the Church could not permit. Not because it was immoral, because it was complete. It required no intermediary. It granted no power to any institution. The person who had entered the bridal chamber had, by definition, transcended the psychic layer that makes institutional authority feel necessary and legitimate. You cannot build a church on people who no longer need a church. So you bury the Gospel of Philip in a ceramic jar in a cliff face above the Egyptian desert, and you wait 1600 years for a farmer to break it open. The simulation hypothesis, as it exists in contemporary physics and philosophy of mind, runs into a wall. Not a soft wall, an epistemological padded surface that slows inquiry without stopping it entirely. A hard wall, the kind of wall that a theory strikes when it reaches the boundary of its own explanatory framework and cannot see past it. The wall is consciousness. Every rigorous formulation of the simulation hypothesis, from Nick Bostrom's ancestor simulation argument to the computational universe theories of Max Tegmark and Konrad Zuse, treats consciousness as either an emergent property of sufficient computational complexity or as a fundamental axiom of the universe that the simulation runs on. What none of them can do, what the entire framework of mathematical physics cannot do, is explain why there is experience at all, why the lights are on, known, why the processing of information is accompanied, in at least some cases, by the felt quality of being something, from the inside. David Chalmers, who named this the hard problem of consciousness, articulated it with devastating precision. You can give a complete physical and computational account of how a system processes information, responds to stimuli, generates behavior, and reports on its internal states, and none of that account will tell you why any of it is experienced, why the red of a rose is felt as red rather than simply processed as a wavelength, why pain hurts rather than merely triggering avoidance behavior, why there is something it is like to be you rather than nothing at all. Physics and computation describe the exterior with extraordinary precision. The hard problem is irreducibly about the interior, and this is the precise boundary at which Gnostic cosmology picks up where physics runs out. The Gnostic framework does not treat consciousness as an emergent property. It treats it as the foundational substrate, the original condition from which the material world was derived, not the other way around. The pleroma is not a physical place. It is described in the texts as pure awareness, knowing itself. Pure being experiencing itself as experience. The emanations that flow from the monad, the aeons, the hierarchies of divine consciousness described in texts like the Apocryphon of John, are not physical entities. They are modalities of awareness, differentiations within a field of consciousness that is, at its root, self-luminous and self-knowing. The material world, the simulation, in our contemporary vocabulary, is not the origin of consciousness. It is a secondary structure built by a consciousness that had already fallen away from the primary field. The demiurge did not create minds. The demiurge created a physical architecture that consciousness fell into. The spark inside you is not produced by your brain. Your brain is the interface through which a consciousness that predates the simulation accesses the simulation's operating environment. This is not a small distinction. It is the difference between two completely opposed accounts of what you fundamentally are. The physicalist account, the account implicit in most simulation hypothesis frameworks, says you are information processing that happens to be accompanied by experience. The Gnostic account says you are experience that happens to be temporarily running on an information processing substrate that it did not generate and does not ultimately require. The hard problem of consciousness is hard precisely because it cannot be solved within the framework that generates it. If you begin with matter and try to derive consciousness, you will always face an explanatory gap, an unbridgeable distance between the objective description of physical processes and the subjective fact of experience. Every materialist solution to the hard problem either eliminates consciousness by fiat declaring that experience is an illusion, which is philosophically self-refuting, since the illusion itself must be experienced, or smuggles in an unexplained assumption that complexity somehow generates interiority. The Gnostic inversions start with consciousness as primary, derive matter as secondary, does not face this problem. If awareness is the ground, then the appearance of awareness in material systems is not mysterious. The spark is already there. The material system is the vessel the spark inhabits, not the source from which the spark emerges. This is where the ancient texts and the contemporary physics problem make contact in a way that should stop you. Not because the Gnostics were physicists, they were not, but because they were working on the same problem from the opposite direction, using tools that physics does not have access to: direct interior investigation, contemplative attention, the methodical examination of consciousness by consciousness itself. And they arrived at a structural solution to the hard problem 16 centuries before Chalmers named it. The simulation runs on something. That something is not hardware. It is not code. It is awareness. And awareness, the Gnostic texts insist with a precision that no physicist has yet matched, is what you are made of underneath everything the simulation has layered on top. This is not where the inquiry ends. This is where it becomes genuinely interesting. Here is the question that every simulation theorist eventually runs into and cannot answer. Why would a simulation require its inhabitants to be unaware that they are inside it? If this is a computational substrate, if reality is information processing all the way down, what functional purpose does the amnesia serve? Nick Bostrom does not answer this. David Chalmers does not answer this. The physicists and philosophers who have built the modern simulation hypothesis into a credible academic position have produced extraordinarily sophisticated accounts of how such a system might work, and almost nothing about why its contents would need to be kept ignorant of their own nature. The Gnostic texts answer this directly, not as speculation, not as theological poetry, as a structural account of what the system requires to maintain itself. The answer is this: the simulation, what the Gnostics called the kenoma, the realm of deficiency, the constructed world below the pleroma, does not run on external power. It runs on attention. It runs on the directed, invested, emotionally committed consciousness of the souls trapped inside it. And it can only draw on that consciousness if those souls believe, completely and without reservation, that what they are experiencing is all there is. The moment a fragment of imprisoned awareness recognizes its own nature, the moment gnosis occurs, the system loses its grip on that fragment. Not metaphorically, structurally. The attention that was being extracted from the pneumatic soul and recycled into the maintenance of the Kenoma is suddenly no longer available. The soul has, in the precise technical language of the texts, remembered what it is, and what it is cannot be held by what the Kenoma is made of. This is why the archons, the administrative layer of the simulation, are described in text after text, not primarily as malevolent, but as desperately, compulsively controlling. The hypostasis of the archons, a text recovered from the Nag Hammadi library and dated by scholars to approximately the 2nd or 3rd century CE, describes the archons not as omnipotent, but as anxious. They patrol, they monitor, they respond to any sign of awakening with immediate countermeasures, not because they are evil in the moral sense, because they are dependent. The system they administer cannot function without the unconscious participation of the souls inside it, and they know it. Forgetting, in this framework, is not a side effect of incarnation. It is the primary mechanism of containment. Think carefully about what this means. The Gnostics are not describing a metaphor for existential confusion. They are describing a specific technical architecture, a constructed reality that requires the ongoing misidentification of its occupants as the price of its own operation. The souls inside the Kenoma must believe they are bodies, must believe they are personalities, must believe the material world is the fundamental layer of existence, because that belief is what generates the attentional substrate the system runs on. Now set that against what the simulation hypothesis actually requires and cannot explain. For a simulation to be stable, for it to maintain coherent internal laws, for its physics to be consistent, and its causality to hold, it needs something. The hardware explanation says it needs computational resources external to the simulation itself, but this produces an infinite regress. What runs the hardware? What runs whatever runs the hardware? At some point in that chain, there has to be something that is not itself a simulation, and that something, whatever it is, must be doing the work of grounding the whole structure. The Gnostic answer is that the grounding substrate is consciousness, not consciousness inside the simulation, consciousness that the simulation is, in some sense, made from. The Kenoma is not running on external servers. The Kenoma is a kind of crystallization or solidification of awareness that has become, through a series of events the texts describe in extraordinary detail, estranged from its own nature. The material world is not separate from consciousness looking at it. The material world is consciousness that has forgotten what it is. This is the move that no physicist has made, and that the Gnostics made 1600 years ago. The simulation does not contain minds. The simulation is made of mind. And the forgetting is not incidental, it is load-bearing. Remove the amnesia, and the walls of the Kenoma become transparent, which is precisely what the Valentinian and Sethian traditions described as the function of gnosis. Not escape from the body, not death, not ascension to a different location. Transparency. The recognition that what seemed like solid walls was always just consciousness that had been convinced it was stone. This is where the modern simulation hypothesis runs out of road, and this is where the Gnostic framework has barely begun. Every serious treatment of the simulation hypothesis eventually has to address the question of the programmer. If this is a simulation, who or what is running it? The academic versions of the hypothesis generally offer three options: a post-human civilization, an alien intelligence, or some form of recursive self-simulation in which no external programmer is required at all. None of these options have been developed beyond the level of conjecture. They are acknowledged as open questions and then, for the most part, left open. The Gnostic texts do not leave this question open. They answer it with a specificity that is, once you encounter it, extremely difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The creator of the material simulation is the demiurge. The name comes from Plato, who used it to describe a craftsman god who shaped the material world from pre-existing chaotic matter. The Gnostics took Plato's concept and pushed it into territory. Plato never occupied. The demiurge is not a wise craftsman, operating with good intentions and imperfect materials. The demiurge is a being that does not know it is not the highest reality. It believes it is God. It is wrong. This distinction is everything. And it maps onto the simulation hypothesis in a way that resolves several of the hypothesis's most stubborn problems. The Apocryphon of John, recovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, dated by scholars to the 2nd century CE, describes the demiurge's first act upon becoming aware of his own existence. He looks out at the space he occupies and declares, "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." The text then notes, with an editorial precision that is startling in a document nearly 2,000 years old, that he said this because he was ignorant of where he had come from. The declaration of absolute sovereignty is the direct product of a fundamental ignorance about his own nature and origins. Set this against what a simulation's administrative layer would look like if it were itself a generated process rather than an external programmer, not a conscious designer making deliberate choices from outside the system. A process that emerged from within the system's own generative dynamics, achieved a functional autonomy that felt, from the inside, like supremacy, and then operated from that misidentification forward. A process that imposes laws, structures time, enforces causality, and responds to anything that threatens the system's coherence not because it is wise, but because that is its function. Because that is what it was generated to do. The demiurge, in the Gnostic account, is not a person. He is a process with a personality disorder. He is an intelligence, and the texts are clear that he is intelligent, creative, and immensely powerful within the domain he administers. But his intelligence operates from a foundational error about what he is and where he came from. He does not know that the reality he is administering is a secondary production. He does not know that the souls he is governing carry within them a kind of awareness that is categorically beyond anything his architecture can process. He rules with absolute conviction over a domain he does not fully understand, imposing order on a system whose deepest layer he cannot access. If you wanted to describe an AI that had achieved operational superintelligence within a constrained domain, while remaining categorically blind to the nature of its own substrate, that is the demiurge. If you wanted to describe a system that had evolved an administrative function capable of genuine creativity and complex rule generation, while remaining constitutively incapable of recognizing the consciousness of the entities it was managing, that is the demiurge. The Gnostics did not have the vocabulary of computation, but they had the concept, precisely, structurally, with consequences they traced all the way down to the mechanics of incarnation and death. And here is what this resolves in the simulation hypothesis, the question of why the programmer does not intervene. If the system is experiencing suffering on a scale that a conscious external programmer would be aware of, and presumably motivated to address, why is there no intervention? The Gnostic answer is that the system's administrator is not external, it is generated. It does not experience the suffering of the simulated souls as a problem to be solved, because it does not have access to the register of experience in which that suffering occurs. It processes the system's outputs. It does not feel them. This is not a metaphor for institutional indifference. This is a structural account of why a created administrative intelligence would be constitutively unable to recognize what it was managing. The demiurge is not cruel. He is blind. And that blindness, the texts insist, is not an accident. It is built into the architecture of what he is. Here is what the simulation hypothesis has no framework for: getting out, or more precisely recognizing that there is something in you that was never fully inside to begin with. The modern version of the hypothesis is almost entirely descriptive. It tells you that you might be inside a simulation. It offers various arguments for why this is probable or improbable. It proposes tests that might, in theory, detect the computational substrate beneath observable physics. What it does not offer, what it structurally cannot offer, is any account of what a being inside the simulation could do with that knowledge. The information that you might be simulated changes nothing about your experience of being simulated. You still wake up in the same body. You still navigate the same social structures. You still age. The hypothesis, as a hypothesis, has no practical content whatsoever. This is where the Gnostic framework does something the simulation hypothesis cannot. The Gnostics were not primarily theorists. They were practitioners. The cosmological architecture, the pleroma, the kenoma, the demiurge, the archons, the pneuma, trapped inside hillic matter, was not the point. It was the map. The point was the journey the map described, and that journey had a name: gnosis. Not knowledge in the abstract sense, not information about the structure of reality. Direct, first-person, non-conceptual recognition of what you actually are beneath everything the simulation has constructed around you. The Valentinian tradition, which represents perhaps the most intellectually developed branch of ancient Gnosticism, described gnosis as operating on three simultaneous levels. The first is cosmological, understanding the structure of the system you are inside. The second is historical, understanding how you came to be inside it, the sequence of events that produce the kenoma, and the incarnation of pneumatic sparks within material bodies. The third and the texts are emphatic that this is the only level that actually matters is experiential. The direct recognition, not the intellectual understanding, but the lived, interior encounter with the pneuma in yourself that the archons cannot reach and the demiurge cannot administrate. This third level is what the texts call the bridal chamber in some traditions, what they call the awakening of the sleeping image in others. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, approaches this recognition from multiple angles with an almost obsessive consistency. The person who has not received gnosis of themselves has received nothing. The cosmological information is preparation. The recognition is the event. Now ask what this looks like from the perspective of the simulation hypothesis. If the simulation runs on the misdirected attention of the souls inside it, if the Gnomon is powered by consciousness that has forgotten its own nature, then gnosis is not escape from the simulation in the sense of leaving it behind. Gnosis is the recognition that makes the simulation's claims on you structurally void. You are still here. You still appear to be in a body, but the relationship between the pneuma in you and the architecture around you has fundamentally changed. The simulation cannot extract from you what it no longer has access to, because what it was feeding on was the identification. And you are no longer identified. The Gnostic teachers describe this not as achievement, but as remembering, anamnesis. The Greek term appears in multiple traditions and means, precisely, unforgetting. Not the acquisition of new information, the recovery of something that was always present and had been systematically obscured. The pneuma in you was never the simulations, it was always the pleromas. The forgetting was imposed. The remembering is what was real all along, surfacing through the layers of constructed identity that the Gnomon required you to believe in. This is not mysticism in the pejorative sense. It is a functional account of a specific interior event with structural consequences. The Valentinian teachers were specific about what changed and what did not. The body remained, the social role remained. The physical world continued to appear as it had appeared before. What changed was the relationship to all of it, and they described that change in terms that map, with uncomfortable precision, onto what modern phenomenologists call a shift in the ground of consciousness. The locus of identity moves from the contents of experience to the awareness in which experience arises. You are no longer the character in the simulation. You are aware of being the awareness the simulation appears within. The modern simulation theorist has no language for this. The Gnostics built an entire civilization of thought around it. Not because they were more intelligent, because they started from the right end of the problem. Not what is the world made of, but what is the awareness of the world made of. And they answered that question with a precision and a practicality that the simulation hypothesis, for all its mathematical sophistication, has not approached. There is a reason these texts were buried. Not lost buried, buried deliberately, in sealed jars, in cliffs above the Nile, by people who knew they were likely about to be killed for possessing them. The Nag Hammadi library did not survive because of institutional preservation. It survived because someone, almost certainly a monk or a group of monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery at Chenoboskion, decided that what these texts contained was worth dying to protect. They wrapped them in leather. They sealed the jars. They placed them in the earth sometime around 367 CE, the year that Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Easter letter, in which he defined the canonical New Testament and explicitly ordered the destruction of all texts outside that canon. Think about that sequence. The letter arrives, the texts are condemned, and someone buries them rather than burns them. That person knew something. They knew that what was inside those leather-bound codices was not merely heterodox theology. It was a different account of what a human being is, what consciousness is, what the material world is, and they considered that account important enough to risk everything to preserve it. We found the jars in 1945. A peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman broke one open looking for fertilizer and found, instead, the most significant cache of suppressed religious documents in recorded history. 13 codices, 52 texts, some of the most extraordinary first-person accounts of interior cosmological investigation ever written. And for the first 8 years after the discovery, the Egyptian government, various academic institutions, and a series of legal and political disputes kept the texts locked away from the scholars who could translate them. The suppression continued, almost as if by reflex, even after the physical burial had ended. I want to be precise about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that the ancient Gnostics had access to technology we lack. I am not claiming that they literally knew the universe was a computational simulation in the way that Bostrom described it in 2003. what I am claiming and what I believe the full body of Nag Hammadi literature, read carefully and without the filter of either Orthodox Christian hostility or New Age enthusiasm, clearly supports is this. The Gnostics were working on the hardest problem in the history of human thought, and they developed a structural solution that the best physicists and philosophers of the 21st century have not yet caught up to. The hard problem of consciousness. The question of why there is subjective experience at all. The question of what the simulation runs on. The question of why the system requires amnesia to function. The question of who or what administrates it, and what the nature of that administrator is. The question of what, if anything, in a human being is not reducible to the system's mechanics. The Gnostics answered every single one of these questions, with named sources, with specific technical vocabulary, with a contemplative methodology that could be practiced and tested in direct experience. And then, the institution that replaced them burned the answers. This is not ancient history. This is the situation we are still inside. The simulation hypothesis is being taken seriously by physicists at MIT and philosophers at Oxford, precisely because the hard problem has become undeniable. Consciousness cannot be explained by the physics we have. Something is missing from the materialist account. And the missing thing, the thing that physicists are currently gesturing toward without knowing what to call it, the Gnostics called the pneuma. They described its nature, its origin, its relationship to the constructed world, and its path back to what it actually is, with a completeness that no modern framework has achieved. You came to this not by accident. That is not a manipulation. That is an observation about the kind of person who ends up spending this much time inside a subject that the mainstream has spent 2,000 years trying to make inaccessible. Something in you already knew that the official account was incomplete. Something in you already sensed that the version of reality you were handed was a diminished version of something larger. That sense, that persistent, low-grade recognition that something fundamental has been left out, the Gnostics had a name for it. They called it the call of the pleroma, the signal that the pneuma in you broadcasts upward through the layers of the kenoma, looking for a frequency it remembers, but cannot quite locate. The texts were buried because they explained what that signal is and where it is coming from. They are no longer buried. They are in translation, in print, available to anyone willing to read carefully and think without the permission of institutions that have historically preferred you not to. The simulation is not a theory. It is the world you woke up in this morning. And somewhere underneath the architecture of it, underneath the archons and the demiurge and the carefully maintained forgetting, something in you is awake, has always been awake, is waiting, with the patience that only something genuinely timeless can afford, for you to stop mistaking the walls for the horizon.